De Val's gather to celebrate New Year. Princess Aisling de Val marked the start of 3308 by introducing her cousin Hadrian de Val, his wife and their newborn son to Imperial High Society. Entertainment journalist Solomon Helios broadcast a report on the event. It's an annual tradition for Princess Aisling to invite the great and the good to her palace on Emerald, although the tragic loss of her father in 3306 meant that last year's gathering was cancelled. This year she made up for it with a sumptuous, glittering celebration of the kind that we Imperials are famed for. For the first time, Hadrian de Val and Lady Astrid Minerva de Val were in attendance. This youthful couple were surprisingly charming for a pair who would once have been arrested on sight. They entertained guests with stories of trading and fighting aboard tiny ships, from the days when their only title was commander. However, the real guest of honor spent most of his time asleep, oblivious to the colossal attention he drew. Yes, baby Hector made his very first public appearance, having been born while his parents were under senatorial protection. Many dignitaries insisted on having their image recorded beside the future emperor, a phrase one could hear being murmured throughout the palace. But what of the current emperor? Unlike Hadrian's family, Arisa Lavigny de Val remains in seclusion and only communicates remotely with the Senate. Now that the terrorists have been quelled, surely the time has come for Her Imperial Majesty to reappear before her loyal subjects. Whistleblower reveals Imperial link to NMLA. A potential connection between the NMLA's dark comms network and Imperial intelligence has been made public by one of ACT's co-leaders. Captain Saskia Landau sent a personal statement to all major media outlets. The majority of my career has been with the Imperial Internal Security Service, but I was seconded for a year to a classified project run by Imperial Intelligence. To coordinate their operations, they use a sophisticated communications system known as the Omega Grid. This is designed to avoid detection or interception by enemies of the Empire. I have reviewed ACT's research into the NMLA's dark comms network and can verify its similarity to Omega Grid technology. Since this is exclusively under Imperial Intelligence's control, it suggests that an individual or group within the organization was making it available to the NMLA. I'm aware that revealing this information publicly may end my career or even endanger my life. Nevertheless, I have shared my findings with ACT's leadership and call upon the Imperial Senate to open an independent investigation into this evidence. As yet there has been no response from Imperial Intelligence or the Senate. However, several agents of the IISS have anonymously spoken to reporters from the Imperial Herald, verifying that the Omega Grid system does exist and has been in use for many years. De Val's gather to celebrate New Year. Princess Aisling de Val marked the start of 3308 by introducing her cousin Hadrian de Val, his wife and their newborn son to Imperial High Society. Entertainment journalist Solomon Helios broadcast a report on the event. It's an annual tradition for Princess Aisling to invite the great and the good to her palace on Emerald, although the tragic loss of her father in 3306 meant that last year's gathering was cancelled. This year she made up for it with a sumptuous, glittering celebration of the kind that we Imperials are famed for. For the first time, Hadrian de Val and Lady Astrid Minerva de Val were in attendance. This youthful couple were surprisingly charming for a pair who would once have been arrested on sight. They entertained guests with stories of trading and fighting aboard tiny ships, from the days when their only title was commander.
Christmas ride on the midnight train, carrying word of your disease.
Hey everyone, it is Tom again, Commander Half-Lock PC and PS4, back from my Tuesday reading stream and public shaming of everyone else stream. My fly's open, I can see it out of the corner of my eye, so I'm going to close that in just a second. What's going on? I can't tell if this is extremely loud, so give me just a second. I'm going to get this background video volume turned down just a little bit so it is not dominating the soundscape. I forgot that today was Tuesday when I woke up this morning, so what I did was give myself a little bit of time to chill out and then have a gigantic breakfast. I made a huge egg scramble with onions and some taco chicken meat that was left over from tacos that I had a couple nights ago, and then a little bit of cheese, and then I toasted up some bread and put butter on it, and then I fried up some potatoes that I had left over from a while back with a little bit of allspice, and then I ate it, and it was good. And then I turned on some Game of Thrones, because that show is still the shit after all of these years. And then I remembered it was Tuesday, so I had to go through the whole rigmarole of setting up the lights, setting up the green screen, and then taking a shower and shaving and cleaning myself, because I don't do that anymore, because there's just no reason to. For you, I did it for the audience of America, so that I could get up here and shame you and make you feel horrible about who you are as people, and also inform you about why it is that you're horrible people. So you're welcome, America. Anyway, what's happening in the news today is not all that exciting. According to the news, the Olympics are happening, and a bunch of ski jumpers got disqualified because they were wearing baggy clothes, which, as a person of color who grew up in an urban area, is really sort of par for the course in this globalizing world. There are reports that the Kremlin is denying that Russia, or that Putin has been trying to tamp down the flames of the conflict in Ukraine, according to the headline. That's sort of a weird juxtaposition of ideas. Although in a certain sense it also sort of makes a lot of sense for the Russian government to be making very clear that its president doesn't have any intention of abiding by what the West and its no-take-backsies policy is demanding to be the temperature and valence of the narrative. So for all we know, Russia's going to try to invade Ukraine. And it's been a long time coming, and they sort of deserve it. Beyond that, there's not much I can say about what's happening in the news that's particularly interesting to me. The Supreme Court's doing stuff. Someone just put out an article about that babe, Amy Coney Barrett, having a long-term plan to convert the entirety of the Supreme Court and the American justice system into one of a Christian theology, which I thought was interesting. Strangely, how do I put this? what is the appropriate word for that specific thing? Crazy pants, but interesting. In Elite Dangerous news, the Alliance and Sirius Pact is still causing problems. So for those of you who aren't aware of what Elite Dangerous is, it's a video game that was released in 2004 to 2014 to great acclaim and an immense degree of support from older users of the franchise's earlier iterations, namely the original Elite, which came out in 1984 when I was 2 years old. Game came out. It became a relatively tight-knit community, from what I can tell, until about 2019 when they released their most recent expansion, Odyssey, which the user base has given a resounding no. This is garbage rating. I've looked at the videos. It's essentially an expansion of a space flight sim with MMO elements and grand strategy elements that took that space flight MMO grand strategy game and turned it, or at least added to it, a first-person shooter combat type thing amidst all this other stuff. It's a incredible vision for a game, and I'm a lover of the game for its being a spaceflight sim. But what they did with it was, I think, is an amazing thing. According to a number of the users that have actually touched Odyssey, which I haven't because I'm generally a console player and my computer's extremely slow, it's a great idea that was executed poorly. So the poor execution is what has been driving a lot of the negativity from the user base that I've come across. No one's yelling at me for making a bad game. But there is a certain degree of hostility and a certain degree of bickering amongst the people that play the game about what is worth what. I forgot to do my flag. That's the game. That is all of this shit. That is the entire backdrop of Nane Incorporated. Is a galaxy of 600 trillion people, each of which with their own lives, each of which with their own aims and goals and hopes and dreams, under various forms of governance, doing their thing. The Sirius Pack. Sirius is one of the major players in terms of power play. Headed by some Chinese-looking guy. And it is the company that also released like the major technological innovations that make this game within its own diegetic universe possible. They created the frameshift drive in the post-World War III era. This is a different World War III than the one we're about to deal with Russia and China kicking off a European war. This is one that happens like 100 years, 200 years from now. Something we don't particularly have to worry about for another 200, 300 years. The Alliance is an independent trade group of different planets and countries that are doing their thing. It's an in-depth universe. I highly recommend you spend the time getting to know it if you're into science fiction, if you're into that massive intergalactic science fiction with like deep histories, the Foundation stuff, if you're into that, Dune, some of the latter Orson Scott Card stuff, or even the early stuff. What's his face? There's another guy. No, I can't remember him. I wish I could remember, but I can't. Anyway, if you're into that like major science fiction with political intrigue kind of stuff, it's in there. The game itself is a spaceflight sim. You can do what you want in it. You can also interact with other people if you so choose to do so. And that is the backdrop for that. Today, because I'm a little absent-minded, as you can tell, I don't have a noted plan of what I'm going to be talking about, as much as just sort of giving the updates of random shit that I partially care about. I'll be reading again from not just one book, but from 3 different books this time. And when you listen to it, just remember, I'm informing you for the purpose of your own cultivation and internalization of the deep, deep shaming that I want you to endure. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Now, the first book I'm going to be reading from, is a book that was assigned to me in undergrad, that I've subsequently read through a couple of other times. I just do that sometimes. I just read books again. Not so much for its relevance within the field, which is not a field that I particularly find all that interesting, to the extent that I want to go to a deep dive into that specificity. But it's just a very interesting theoretical book, or rather, relatively interesting book with a relatively interesting theoretical premise. The book is called Ordering and Ordering the 21st. That's not how you spell 21st century. Understanding Borders. It was written by Gabriel Popescu, or Popescu. I don't know how to pronounce it. I like the way that Popescu sounds, but I highly doubt that's how it's pronounced. But this is the book. It's a weird place for that. Anyway, I'll be reading the first chapter of this book, or at least a section from the first chapter. It's a pretty long one. I've gotten bored in the 3 times that I've done this thus far with just reading for hella long. So I might just do a slight, what do they call it? Excerpt reading. Anyway, so Ordering the 21st Century, Understanding Borders by Gabriel Popescu. Chapter 1 is called Making Sense of Borders. Introducing borders. Borders are typically understood as limits and conceived of as lines. They also carry with them a sense of division or separation in space. However, such perceptions offer limited insight into the immensely complex world of borders and boundaries. Border making, also referred to as bordering, is a much more ambiguous process than generally assumed. Nature does not offer compelling rationales to justify the erection of borders between places. Regardless, border making is an old human practice traceable to the earliest societies. This fact indicates that borders are enduring fixtures in human societies, which in turn causes border making to appear as a natural preoccupation for humans. The view I've adopted throughout this book is that borders are social phenomena, made by humans to help them organize their lives. Humans erect borders as a way to mediate between the familiar of here and the unfamiliar of there. Throughout history, border change has been the norm rather than the exception. The meaning of borders has varied widely from place to place as well as from time to time. Borders did not exist. Borders did not exist in the same location since primordial time, nor did they perform the same function in all places at all times. Borders are not fixed. They are transitory. I'm hearing things in my video. I'm hearing things in my video, in my Twitch fucking beta that aren't good. Hold on a second. Technical difficulties. Anyway, continuing. Borders are not fixed. They are transitory, and they always change in space and time. They're not simply lines, but rather areas and networks of variable depth. Borders come in a variety of sizes and shapes, which indicates that they can be constructed based on a multitude of criteria. Thus, all boundaries are made by someone else. Thus, all boundaries are made by someone. Since individuals define the criteria by which borders are constructed, there are no God, that's getting really distracting, actually. Whatever that is extremely distracting. So what I'm gonna do, switch some shit up real quick. Trying to make this a little bit easier to deal with. Alright, hopefully that's not gonna be as fucked. I'm gonna start from that paragraph again because that was something special. Hello. That's in there. Alright. The view that I've adopted throughout this book is that borders are social phenomena made by humans to help them organize their lives. Humans erect borders as a way to mediate between the familiar of here and the unfamiliar of there. Throughout history, border change has been the norm rather than the exception. The meaning of borders has varied widely from place to place as well as from time to time. Borders do not exist in the same locations. Borders do not exist in the same location since primordial times, nor do they provide the same function in all places at all times. Borders are not fixed. They are transitory, and they always change in space and in time. They are not simply lines, but rather areas and networks of variable depth. Borders come in a variety of sizes and shapes, which indicates that they can be constructed based on a multitude of criteria. Thus, all boundaries are made by someone, since individuals define the criteria by which borders are constructed. Thus, all boundaries are made by someone, since individuals define the criteria by which borders are constructed. There are no natural borders to separate human beings in space. Or are there? Borders are first and foremost about power. Border making is a power strategy that uses difference to assert control over space by inscribing difference in space. Through borders, difference acquires a territorial expression. The territorialization of difference is an exclusionary power practice with profound structuring effects on societies as it determines membership in society, who belongs where, who is an insider, and who is an outsider, who is part of us and who is part of them. Under these circumstances, borders have traditionally served the role of ordering society. Making borders is a means for organizing human behavior in space by regulating movement in space. Thus, bordering space is a means of ordering space. Two sides of the process by which humans appropriate space. That was a clunky sentence, I'm going to reread that. Borders have traditionally served the role of ordering society. Making borders is a means for organizing human behavior in space by regulating movement in space. Thus, bordering space is a means of ordering space. Two sides of the process by which humans appropriate space. Some borders are primarily symbolic, cultural, or social in nature, such as linguistic and religious boundaries, or class boundaries. Humans tend to carry such boundaries with them when they move through space. Other borders are primarily physical or territorial in nature, such as state borders. These borders are often well marked on the ground to assure their visibility and stability in the landscape. Most often boundaries are both symbolic and physical at the same time, since symbolic borders can have territorial dimensions and territorial borders can be symbolic as well. For example, linguistic criteria have been used to establish the location of state borders, while in other instances state borders mark the spatial limits of a language. With the increase in the number of territorial states throughout the world during the modern era, state borders emerged as the quintessential illustration of borders in people's minds. Although state territorial borders are but one among a large variety of borders, albeit a very significant one, they came to assimilate all other kinds of borders and boundaries to the point that borders are typically understood above all as the geographical limits of the state. However, state territorial borders should not be understood as the sum of all other borders and boundaries, or as the most important boundaries affecting people's lives. Gender, religious, or class boundaries, to mention only a few examples, transcend the simplistic inside-outside divide that such borders have established. They bred even the earliest state borders in antiquity, and they have never fit the territorial matrix of modern state borders. Rather, state borders are best understood as both similar and dissimilar from other categories of borders. They influence, and are influenced by other types of borders and boundaries. Making sense of state borders is part of understanding the central role that all borders and boundaries play in the spatial organization of modern societies. State borders are political territorial boundaries. They are territorial and symbolic at the same time, marking the limits of politically organized spaces, as well as suggesting the purported cohesiveness of these spaces. For example, the borders of France represent the limits of the territory of France, and they imply that the people living in this territory are significantly alike. However, the reality is more complex. In addition to the territory of France in Europe, the French state includes several overseas territories stretching from the Pacific Ocean to South America that most people often overlook when thinking about the borders of France. At the same time, people inhabiting the territory of France are not necessarily alike. As many natives of French Guiana or New Caledonia hardly identify their group as French. State borders have the capacity to define territory they enclose by ascribing it with meaning, while at the same time they are defined by their content. By acquiring meaning from what they enclose. State borders have the capacity to define the territory they enclose by ascribing it with meaning, while at the same time they are defined by their content by acquiring meaning from what they enclose. For example, goods produced inside the borders of the United States are labeled Made in the USA, although they may have been made using parts imported from other countries, or may have been made by illegal immigrants. At the same time, the material wealth of the United States suggests to immigrants crossing the United States border that they are crossing a gateway to a better life. Yet not all Americans are wealthy, and a significant portion of the U.S. wealth is generated overseas. An essential aspect of state borders is their double meaning as lines of separation and contact in space. Whenever a line is drawn between two groups of people, that line acquires two meanings simultaneously. On the one hand, it separates the two groups, while on the other it brings them into mutual contact. The double meaning of borders intensifies the complexity of bordering processes. It is impossible to address only one aspect of borders without considering the other one. Every time a border is erected to keep people apart, there will always be some that will want to cross it, if for no other reason than because the border exists. The phenomenon explains in large part the challenge of tackling complex 21st century issues such as security and immigration at the state's borders. State borders separate and bring into contact different national, political, economic, and social systems. The managing of state borders across the world is codified in a variety of border regimes that range from entirely closed, as in the case of North Korea, where movement and exchange with South Korea is virtually absent, to quite open, as in the case of the internal borders of the European Union, where border control checkpoints have been removed. State borders can be walled fortresses and spaces of othering one's neighbors, intended to keep insiders in and outsiders out. Or they can be windows to the world and interfaces of interacting with neighboring countries. However, it is essential to avoid understanding the separation and contact functions of borders as simplistic binary in which they operate in opposition to each other, as these functions occur simultaneously. In practice, state borders have various degrees of permeability, allowing some types of movement while restricting others. For example, despite the closed border between North and South Korea, there is South Korean cross-border investment in North Korea, as well as occasional visits of North Korean delegations to South Korea. The succinct examination of borders and boundaries illustrates the multifaceted nature of the relationship between bordering processes, space, and society. There is no single meaning or purpose behind state borders. Borders and societies are mutually constitutive processes. People decide to set and maintain territorial borders to divide society, while at the same time territorial borders have the power to shape your lives, sense of identity, and how we think about our neighbors. Understanding this symbiotic relationship constitutes the starting point in making sense of the role and the functions of borders in the 21st century, as well as in facilitating public involvement toward making border spaces more democratic and more inclusive of the interests of all categories of citizens, irrespective of their status in society, ethnic identity, or national belonging. I am debating whether or not to read certain parts of this. Such curation is an essential element of producing the outcomes that one intends with one's pedagogy. For instance, your internalized, horrific self-shaming. Borders and territory. Borders and territory are intrinsically connected concepts. Today, the most widely... What's going on? Destroyed something. Boundaries and territory are intrinsically connected concepts. Today, the most widely accepted definition of a border is that of dividing two territorial entities, or that of marking the limit of a territorial entity. Borders can thus be regarded as lines of separation and contact not only between human groups, but between territories as well. Generally, the term territory refers to a portion of space that is claimed or occupied by a person, a group of people, or an institution. In a physical sense, space exists without borders or delineations. The term space can be applied to the entire surface of the Earth. However, people would not be able to make practical sense of space without the existence of borders to delineate it. Borders are discontinuities in space that render space meaningful by compartmentalizing it into distinctive units. Territory as a portion of space implies the existence of boundaries. A territory is a bounded space. The notion of borders is intrinsic to any understanding of territory, since we cannot conceive of a portion of space without conceiving of its limits in regard to other portions of space. In this sense, borders produce territory. They are constitutive of territory. People relate to territory through territoriality. Territoriality? How many of these guys am I just sitting there shooting? I don't remember. I remember playing this specific backdrop. I did it to take a photo of the cutter. That's not a cutter. Of the clipper. When I first got it and started shooting shit with it. I thought this was a longer video. Anyway, territoriality is the process whereby individuals or groups lay claim to territory. According to SAC, territoriality is a spatial strategy to affect, influence, and control resources and people by controlling the area. Territories are defended and contested against others through territoriality. Therefore, territoriality can be understood as a form of power over space. However, control over a territory is typically asserted by the imposition of borders that are used to regulate access to the territory. The erection of borders around territories emerges as a crucial moment in appropriating space. Thus, it is a political strategy used to secure power in society. The most pervasive form of territoriality today is political territoriality, meaning that most political power in society is organized territorially through bounded portions of space. Territory is important for political governance because it provides a locus for the exercise of political authority over a range of interests. Location inside the borders of a territory defines membership to a group instead of, for example, kinship relationships or similarity of interests among the members of the group. Hunting and gathering societies, for example, hunting and gathering societies, for example, while employing territoriality for purposes such as delimiting and defending land, rarely used rigid territorial borders to define belonging to a community. Instead, these societies had a social definition of territoriality and of borders that was based primarily on kinship relations. Modern societies, however, have a territorial definition of society, using territoriality and borders for a wide range of purposes in order to define social membership. I'm skipping a section entitled Borders in the State. Should you choose to read this book, or you find it interesting, the title is on the screen, right there. 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 This is the book. Reading from the first chapter. And you will probably find this book at your local public library. I would advise you go to the main branch, because they tend to have the most books. If you happen to be a member of the California residency ruling, for the most part, you also have access to your local University of California student libraries. You are not allowed to take books out, to the best of my knowledge, if I remember correctly. But you are allowed to walk in and just read some shit. The rule might have changed. It's the last time I tried something like that was back in like 2011, 2012. If you happen to be in any of your other states, in the States, in America, I would suggest you just go ahead and call ahead to your local universities or your local colleges and say, hey, some asshole was reading a book and I think I'm smarter than him, so I want to read the book as well. Do I have access to the library? And they'll probably tell you yes, if it's a state school. You can read this chapter on borders and the state, or this section on borders and the state, if you so choose to do so, at your own leisure. But I will not be reading it today. The section following that is... Oh, fuck, no. Damn it. This is the last section. I do have to read this. Alright, fuck it. Borders in the state. You can still do the thing that I just suggested, by the way. I highly recommend you do that for your own edification. Political territoriality is most strongly manifested today in the form of the modern state. The state is generally associated with political power within territorial borders. According to Passy, in an empirical context, the state is a specific territory with recognized borders, whereas in the theoretical context, the state is a set of institutions aimed at producing and reproducing society. Thus, as a political institution that possesses territorial power, the state has an area over which it claims jurisdiction, and borders that control mobility. Today, the national state has come to represent the basic division of political space. The entire landmass of the world is parceled into roughly 200 neatly delineated states. States are historically dynamic artifacts. They are not universal or natural political territorial institutions for the organization of society. Tribes, which have served in many cultures to organize society, long preceded the state. Moreover, states are not permanent. They frequently appear and disappear from the world political map. The Polish state disappeared 3 times over the course of its history. Texas, which was an independent state before its incorporation into the United States, and South Sudan is the latest state. Texas was an independent state before its incorporation into the United States, and South Sudan is the latest state to appear in the world in 2011 by breaking off from Sudan. Question about Texas. What do we actually get from Texas? Us here in the States. Like, I know that the United States made a point to cultivate the possibility of California becoming a state because it had all that gold, and as is the relationship between California and specifically the area of San Francisco and the rest of the country, the region can be heavily and devastatingly exploited for its natural resources, and it's sort of an encouraged aspect of that relationship. But like, what's in Texas? I know it's got oil, right? Texas has oil. They've got oil. What else do they have? They got cows, right? Steer, I believe they call them. Steer. They call them steer in Texas. What else do they have in Texas? They got the best little whorehouse. That's right. Yeah. But what else? I mean, they kill retards there. So there's that. The mysteries abound. Continuing with the reading. These examples imply that the borders of these states underwent considerable changes as well. Also, states are not fixed. They constantly change their territorial shape. The vast majority of states existing today established their current borders only in the past 50 years. Throughout history, there have been several types of state, such as city-states, empires, and nation-states. Each type relates in different ways to borders to delineate its political territoriality. The walls of the city-states of antiquity and the medieval era did not delineate political borders, since these cities also incorporated the surrounding hinterland. City-state walls performed primarily a defensive purpose. Empires were often composed of discontinuous territories, and their borders were generally unmarked. Nation-states, on the other hand, tend to have well-delineated territories and clearly marked borders. The nation-state is the contemporary type of state that emerged approximately 200 years ago in the wake of the French Revolution in 1789. A nation-state is understood as a country inhabited by a group of people who see themselves as one distinct community. Its distinctiveness consists mainly in the conceptual merging of political territoriality, as expressed in the institution of the state, with ethnic and cultural identity, as expressed in the idea of the nation, so that their boundaries coincide. A nation is typically defined as a group of people who imagine sharing common elements, such as language, history, ethnic background, political institutions, and attachments to a particular territory. However, there is little agreement as to what exactly the proportion of the mix should be, who decides when a group of people reaches the status of a nation, and where to establish the borders of a nation. As a result of these dilemmas, the number of nations in the world varies widely from several hundred to several thousand. The number of states, however, is just under 200. Now, this was published in 2012, so there might be 3 or 4 more than a couple hundred states at this point. The main predicament of the idea of the nation-state, one state, one nation, is that it assumes congruence between the territorial boundaries of the state and group identity. As there are many more nations than there are states, the nation-state appears a theoretical impossibility. Instead of seeking to de-link the ideas of statehood and nationhood, during the last 200 years, state governments throughout the world have been actively involved in a process of nation-building Using the ideology of nationalism. Nationalism is a territorial ideology that seeks to bind the nation and the state by creating identity based on bounded space. The erection of borders, behind which to build homogeneous nations, has been a key feature of nationalism. At best, nationalism allows the emancipation of certain groups of people from the domination of tyrannical rulers. At its worst, nationalism is responsible for outright forms of violence, as demonstrated by the 1990s ethnic cleansing in both former Yugoslavia and USSR, to mention only two examples. They didn't name the place. Gradually, the nation-state circumscribed social relations inside its borders to an unprecedented extent. It became normal to imagine all the citizens of a given state forming one national society that was distinct from ones beyond the borders with the neighboring states. Under these circumstances, the nation-state came to be seen as a container of society, with the borders of the state forming the walls of the container. Borders became major tools for regulating social relations, both inside the container and across containers. However, nation-building did not result in absolute control of society contained by the state borders. The intensification of transnational flows of capital and people challenges the nation-state's monopoly over power inside its borders and suggests the erosion of the power of borders to serve as territorial containers. The principle of sovereignty constitutes the linchpin between territories, states, and borders. Sovereignty is the claim of exclusive power over a territory. A state's claim to the monopoly of power within its territorial borders have been codified in the modern principle of territorial sovereignty. Although this situation has always been more of an aspiration than an accomplishment, these persistent claims of sovereign control within one's own borders have led to widespread association of sovereignty with border territoriality. During the medieval era, sovereignty was invested in the person of the monarch and signified the divine authority of the emperor to rule over his or her subjects regardless of the territorial boundaries of the empire. With the advent of the modern territorial state during the 17th century, however, sovereignty was gradually transferred from the person of the monarch to the territory of the state. The divine element was replaced by the popular will of the people, at least in theory. A person's political status changed from being a subject of a ruler to being a citizen of a state. The borders of a state came to determine one's political belonging. Borders are linked to sovereignty because they mark the formal extension of territorial power of the state. In legal terms, borders demarcate states' sovereignty. Territorial sovereignty of one state starts at its borders and ends at its borders. Put differently, the state border signifies the end of the authority of one state and the beginning of another's. Consequently, sovereignty is a territorially exclusive practice. A state's legal and taxation systems, social protection policies, and police jurisdiction, for example, all end at its borders, only to re-emerge on the other side of the border as another state's practices and policies. In the modern world, sovereignty has a dual aspect. It is both inward-looking and outward-looking. This dual status implies that the power of state within its territorial boundaries cannot be challenged by other states, while at the same time, for this situation to be possible, states must mutually recognize each other's sovereignty over a bounded territory. Under these circumstances, territorial sovereignty has become the fundamental principle of organization of international relations. It is not sufficient for a state to declare its sovereignty within specific territorial boundaries, but these borders also have to be recognized by other states as well. The principle of territorial sovereignty has created an interstate system in which states are assumed to be equal. The stability of the system is derived from the fact that every state has to recognize and to respect other states' territorial sovereignty. In practice, however, this has hardly been the case. Throughout the world, states have frequently infringed upon each other's sovereignty by advancing territorial claims against their neighbors, or demanding border adjustments. Nevertheless, the principle of territorial sovereignty as such has not been in question. It is only recently that the globalization of capitalist relations of production, as well as of numerous cultural and social processes, have introduced considerable pressures for changing the way we make sense of fundamental aspects of state territorial sovereignty. I will not read the remainder of the chapter, for it is a intense literature review, which will be unnecessary for you. Also, it's a lot of reading to do. I will, however, read two sections, 3 sections. Four of the sections. I'll read 4 of the sections of 6. I will not read them. I will read the titles and then read you one section. Title of the first segment is Frontiers and Borderlines. For any of you who are interested in the concept of frontier, frontier is that area in this book, as it is covered in the book, if I remember correctly, it's been so fucking long. The concept of frontier is that that illegible region surrounding the interior and exterior of a border, and also everything outside the border. The border is placed, there is still an area just outside it, and just within that border that is constantly being renegotiated and things of that sort. That's the idea of frontier that is expressed in this book. It's a relative zone of indistinction, so to speak. The next section is called the social construction of borders. I don't remember what this section talks about. But I assume it has something to do with what people do in terms of coming to understand what their border is. Next section is called Discourses, Borders, and Identity. I will read this section. Borders are today largely seen as discursively constructed. In the social sciences, discourses are typically understood as constituted by a collection of theories, writings, public speeches, and popular media broadcasts that create a specific context that dominates the interpretation of a given issue. Discourses are inevitably biased representations of reality. The notion that discourses play crucial roles in the construction of borders shows that the existence of borders requires a process of continual discursive production and reproduction in order to maintain borders' relevance in people's lives. Geography and history textbooks, images of border crossing and checkpoints or fences, patriotic songs, national maps, and passport control booths all constitute powerful symbols that serve to perpetuate and reinforce state borders in people's minds. Borders are not mirror-like reflections of the divisions existing in the physical cultural landscape, but are fabrications people make to legitimate distinctions between them. Consequently, the production of borders is a geographically and historically contingent process, and therefore the study of borders must be contextual. Passy suggests that the proper context for the study of borders is situated not only in the adjacent borderland areas, but also in the continual process of nation building, the process that provides a narrative account for the identity of the nation-state. At the same time, local experiences and narratives of the border also inform bordering discourses and provide the appropriate context for the understanding of borders. The idea of the discursive creation of borders prepares the ground for the conceptualization of the chicken and egg mutually enforcing relationship between borders and identity, where borders are viewed as identity constitutive, yet at the same time they can also be erected as a result of discourse constituted group identity. Drawing on Said's conceptualization of the role in space in the construction of otherness, the current literature on borders stresses that the collective territorial identity is not generated naturally but is achieved through the erection of borders by exploiting us versus them type discourses. Passy establishes an analytic framework to explain how group identities are constructed through the use of territorial borders. He identifies 4 discourses. The we here, employed to suggest integration within borders of territorial units such as the nation-state. The we there, which demonstrates intention to integrate social groups beyond borders such as separated minorities. The we they within a territory designates refugees and others inside the borders of a territory. The other there, used to inscribe difference on social groups situated outside of the borders of a territory. The implications of these socio-spatial discourses for the understanding of a phenomena, such as nationalism and ethnicity, for example, are paramount. Borders and borderlands emerge as central sites for exploring the construction of various collective identities, and of the ways these identities influence and are influenced by the context of the borderland. I have to blow my nose. The next section is called Borders and Power, and I will also be reading that section. But before I do that, I'm going to let you listen to my remix again while I blow my nose. And I'm not saying it's going to take that long, but it might. I thought the sound was going to fade out on that remix, and it was just a clean cut. It's unfortunate. Anyway, yeah, that's my remix for Red Means Recordings Anticon. I occasionally do remixes under the moniker Electrons and the stuff like that's with an apostrophe. To let you know that Electrons is one example of the stuff like that is. That was one of the relatively recent ones. My head is cloggy because I just blew my nose. So I've got like a bunch of sinus pressure now. So I'm going to get back to the reading. The section being Borders and Power. Borders are sites of power where different political, economic, and social systems come into contact. Border landscapes with barbed wire, watchtowers, and checkpoints are a very visible aspect of this power. However, not all power is visible in border landscapes. Borders are present in various cultural and social practices in which power is invisible. Borders may conceal power resulting from political or economic factors that belong to a multitude of scales beyond and below the national scale. In this way, borders appear to be responsible for various issues that affect people's lives that in fact arise from the desire of one group to dominate another. Moreover, groups that desire to gain or maintain power over other groups and territories can resort to the erection of borders on the grounds of ethnic or religious difference in order to mask their goals of domination. In order to unearth the power of boundaries, we need to ask whose interests are being served by the imposition and maintaining of various borders. In contemporary approaches, borders are often understood as mechanisms that render power emerging from human interactions visible. Who's calling my phone? In just a moment. Got my flatmate on the phone. I want to let you guys watch the Name Incorporated recruitment video now. Hey, what's up? I'm doing my reading stream.
Yeah.
What's going on? How was the drive home?
It was good. I mean, John was on his best behavior. So, yeah, I mean, it was fine. I was grateful. You know, I thanked them and giving him gasoline. Like, okay, but, and my sister has just been wonderful. And Sarah she's in love with San Francisco. I'm like, you don't know.
From the dawn of humankind, we've looked to the stars for meaning. Amidst the trivialities of existence, they have watched over us and forgiven us our awe and wonder. The briefest respite between our labors and
I'm going to be
strife.
getting phone calls from the cops.
In our arrogance, we surrendered to our own conceit.
Me as a contact.
Our search became our right, and for
And you're like,
millennia
you're
we spread
fucking
our
trouble.
message
I'm
of our rightful
snitching
place
you out to
amongst
your
the
aunt so
stars of
fucking
one
hard.
another. The stars aligned, we proclaimed, to provide us with the guidance we required. Our labors became our destiny.
Oh shit, hold on. They can hear me, hold on.
We assumed our place amongst the stars, and the stars watched over us, shivering in approval. In time we forgot. We grew indifferent to our watchful stewards, and turned our attention away from them. We turned to one another. We saw one another, and we took the guidance given us by the stars to show one another the error of one another's ways. The stars have shown us, we proclaimed. The labors we have undertaken and the wars we have fought sanctioned by the stars and just by their guidance. And others proclaimed the stars' condemnation. It is our labors and wars sanctioned. The stars have shown us, the others proclaimed. In our arrogance, we tore the stars from one another. No longer joined as our watchful stewards, the stars became ours, and our rightful place amongst the stars was true to the stars' rightful place amongst us. And in our rightful place we labored, and we made war with one another. And the wars we made with one another drove us further and further amongst the stars, amongst ourselves. And amongst ourselves we looked for meaning. How long is this? I seriously think I'm gonna read all this to you, Dad? Yeah, this is like 5 pages of garbage. Garbage, Dad!
Miles, can you just...
What? It just goes on and on. No one cares about this kind of stuff, Dad.
You just...
Fine. Gosh. I'm picking up here. In 2979, a consortium of scholars, pilots, and private interests came together to discuss our future. Amidst the wars between the Federation, the Empire, and the Alliance, the intrigue, the subterfuge, and the myriad labors of all powers, we were being reminded of our place amongst the stars, and the stars have begun to remind us of their place amongst us. We were not their equals. The stars, this consortium reminded us, had given us meaning and we had squandered its resolve. The stars, this consortium reminded us, had many others over whom they'd watched. And we came to know some of those others over whom the stars watched. The Guardians had taken their place amongst the stars long before us. The Fargoods had taken their place as well. And they too, the stars, reminded of their place. The stars watched over us all, and we had all grown arrogant in our assumption of our place amongst them. In our arrogance, we had turned to one another. We had once come to know our place amongst the stars was our own, this consortium reminded us. And this consortium reminded us that the stars had watched us come to know these things. The stars have begun again to provide us with meaning this consortium now wants us to know. And this consortium is resolved to remind us of this meaning. For this meaning is given us by the stars. This meaning is given us all, and and this resolve the purpose of our labors, our strife. This consortium, we are now reminded, has resolved to remind us all the meaning given us by the stars to all, be us of the Empire, the Federation, the Alliance, or any others. In 3307, the labors and the strife of this consortium, undertaken to remind us all of the meaning being given us by the stars, were given a name. My name is Cadence, and I'm a pilot. My name is Coral. That's it? What? You're just gonna say your name and that's it? You're not gonna say anything about yourself? What, I need to label myself? None of us are super insecure like you, Cadence. What? I'm not insecure, you cunt. Don't talk to me like that.
Girls,
Bitch.
for fuck's sake, can you just stick to the script, please?
Anyway, we're pilots. Speak for yourself. Commanders Half-Lock. We have come to you on behalf of this consortium. We have come to call upon you, as this consortium has charged us, to take your place in the labors and strife this consortium has resolved to undertake, to remind all of the meaning being given us by the stars, to remind all of our place amongst the stars and theirs amongst us. Join us, as this consortium of scholars, pilots, and private interests had joined one another, and had resolved to remind all of the meaning being given us by the stars. We already incorporated. Dad, do we really have to use these voice changers?
Girls.
Yeah, hold on. We just sound like
Girls.
a couple of guys.
I'm going to restart the section. Borders and power. Borders are sites of power where different political, economic, and social systems come into contact. Border landscapes with barbed wire, watchtowers, and checkpoints are a very visible aspect of this power. However, not all power is visible in border landscapes. Borders are present in various cultural and social practices in which power is invisible. Borders may conceal power resulting from political or economic factors that belong to a multitude of scales beyond and below the national scale. In this way, borders appear to be responsible for various issues that affect people's lives that in fact arise from the desire of one group to dominate another. Moreover, groups that desire to gain or maintain power over other groups and territories can resort to the erection of borders on the grounds of ethnic or religious difference in order to mask their goals of domination. In order to unearth the power of boundaries, we need to ask whose interests are being served by the imposition and maintaining of various borders. In contemporary approaches, borders are often understood as mechanisms that render power emerging from human interactions visible. They are expressions of power relations, and they can be perceived as flows of power given their dynamic nature. Borders embody a variety of contradictions and conflicts that are the result of the arbitrary circumstances of boundary making. As a result, understanding borders as sites of power helps us to understand the forces behind various social conflicts, and this in turn can help us to better manage or prevent them. The final two sections are entitled Borders as Institutions and Borders and Globalization. And that is the end of the first chapter of the book, Making Sense of Borders. Does it make sense? Of course it doesn't. It's a very complex issue that's been studied for decades. However, I hope that enunciates certain aspects of what you're trying to understand about borders, which I know is your primary interest. Now, the second book is a book that was assigned in the same class, strangely enough. And this is a compilation of essays, as is generally the case for these massive nerd books. This is entitled, come on, Documenting Individual Identity. That's not how you spell identity. Documenting Individual Identity is edited by Jane Kaplan. Come on. And John Torpy. Torpy. It's not short for torpedo. It's Torpy. And the essay that I will be reading from this book which I will not read in total, was written by Jane Kaplan herself, the editor of the book, entitled This or That Particular Person. Titled This or That Particular Person, Protocols of Identification in 19th Century Europe. This occurred in Europe in the 19th century. Just a moment. Alright, this is chapter 3 of the book. Again, it's entitled This or That Particular Person, Protocols of Identification in the 19th century Europe. Written by Jane Kaplan, who is also the editor of the compilation. The title of this essay is taken from J.G. Fichte's Science of Rights, in a passage discussing a problem familiar to philosophers and police officers. How can they re-identify someone as the same person he once was known to be? And how can they individuate him from others like him? There is a philosophical tradition dating back. There is a philosophical tradition dating from Locke and Hume that has pondered the answer to these questions by means of puzzles isolating the difference between bodily persistence and memory as criteria of personal identity. In this passage of Fichte, however, the police officer stands to the fore with an apparently pragmatic response. To cite the passage at greater length, the chief principle of a well-regulated police state is this, that each citizen shall be at all times and places recognized as this or that particular person. No one must remain unknown to the police. This can be attained with certainty only in the following manner. Each one must always carry a pass with him, signed by his immediate government official, in which his person is accurately described. No person should be received at any place who cannot thus make known by his pass his last place of residence and his name. Particularity means identity, and identity is signaled, perhaps, most publicly and self-evidently by a person's name. This essay will concentrate on the personal name as a component of the apparatus of identification in 19th century France, Germany, and England. By laying out some of the legal and procedural complexities entailed by this universal descriptive designation, I hope to expose some of the processes by which mechanisms of identity were made available for the purposes of identification in a particular historical context. As a preliminary, I offer some brief reflections on the problem of identification as such. The next section is called Identity and Recognition. "What is your name?" asks the captain in Cards of Identity, Nigel Dennis's 1955 satire on the experimental work of the Identity Club. "Surely it is written on your ration book and identity card," to which the artless Mr. Shirk replies, "I've never thought to look, sir. What's come my way, I've eaten and been grateful for, with no thought to spare for the name that's brought it. Now when I'd like to know, I can't find the dratted books. Oh, she used the word drat. Now when I'd like to know, I can't find the dratted books." As Dennis's enigmatic novel goes on to demonstrate, an effective system of identification depends on stabilizing personal identity, self-sameness, to an extent that it is adequate to its operation as a unit in two systems of identification. The correspondence not only between a subjective claim, "I am who I claim to be," but also between a person and a set of signs. This person corresponds to these signs. A standardized system of identification and recognition, such as Fichte's, recommends that Dennis satirizes is distinguished, therefore, both by the stability or replicability of its operations and by their relative invisibility, in contrast with older, more public regimes that were sustained by the distinctively clothed or marked body and by individual face-to-face encounters. And, as the same example shows, this new system of identity documents represented the addition of official authentication and verification to recognition alone. This was a crucial development in a society of increasing size, mobility, and anonymity. It was also part of an older and much broader movement toward a culture of documentary proofs in judicial and official transactions. But in spite of every effort at standardization, the culture of identification is essentially unruly, not only because of its vast scope and variety, but because even in its most controlling and technologized forms, it is based on a concept that is itself difficult to stabilize and control. The term identity, as I have already suggested, incorporates the tension between identity, as the self-same, in an individualizing, subjective sense, and identity, as the sameness with another, in a classifying, objective sense. The term identity, as I have already suggested, incorporates the tension between identity as the self-same in an individualizing, subjective sense, and identity as sameness with another, in a classifying, objective sense. Here the juridical identification of the individual actor meets the categorical identification of a type or class. In virtually any systematics of identification, everyone is not only himself, but also potentially the embodiment of a type. And in an important respect, the history of identification is a history not so much of individuality as of categories and their indicators. As Beatrice Frankel has pointed out in her imaginative theory of the signature, one ends by granting that identity is at the same time that which distinguishes an individual from others and that which assimilates him to others. This dual meaning seems to give the term a peculiar internal coherence, or at least to keep it constantly in motion against itself, even before one addresses any of the mechanical problems of operating an efficient system of identification in practice. Jeremy Bentham formulated the fundamental question of identification as this: who are you with whom I have to deal? In this study of in his study of anagnorisis, or the poetics of recognition, anagnorisis, that is a hell of a word. In his study of anagnorisis, or the poetics of recognition. I don't remember reading the word anagnorisis. Or the poetics of recognition, Terence Cave has observed that the proof of recognition is not identity per se, that would be tautologous, but a sign which stands for the authentic object and that object only, in a relationship of contiguity. The recognition sign is a synecdoche. The recognition sign is a synecdoche. Without this synecdochic semeion, oh good God, difference cannot be resolved into identity. The token proclaims as unique an individual which cannot on its own sufficiently make good its uniqueness. This then is the function of identity document. This then is the function of the identity document. It is the portable token of an originary act of bureaucratic recognition as the authentic object, an accurate description of the bearer recognized and signed by an accredited official, and available for repeated acts of probative ratification. The experience of self-sameness is thus never unmediated, either subjectively or objectively. It operates through a system of signs and recognitions that intrudes alterity into the heart of identity. This is the critical tension at the heart of a culture of identification. Indeed, according to Cave, although recognition scenes may look like resolutions, they are actually what he calls problem moments that disclose an essential instability. To tell a story which ends in recognition is to perform one of the most quintessential acts of fictional narrative, fictional narration. The recognition scene is, as it were, the mark or signature of a fiction, so that even if something like it occurs as a fact, it still sounds like fiction and will probably be retold as such. The giddy spiral of tokens encompasses the relationship between fact and fiction, between the identity document and its bearer, between the component signs or representations of identity and the document. How then does the identity document in fact document identity, in the sense of furnishing adequate proof of claims and correspondences for official purposes? Beatrice Frankel has suggested that all those signs of identity are in one sense heterogeneous and disorderly. The elementary signs of modern identity have come to be conventionalized as the same, as the name, the portrait, and the fingerprint. These correspond, by a logic that is surely not accidental, to C.S. Peirce's second trichotomy of signs, namely his differentiation among symbol, icon, and index, according to the sign's own character. In the Peircean system of signs, the symbol, here the proper name, is the Saussurean signifier, that is an arbitrary sign that has neither resemblance nor an existential relationship to its referent. The icon, the portrait, represents its object mainly by its similarity to it. The relationship between signifier and signified is not arbitrary, but is one of resemblance or likeness. The index, finally, refers to its object, because it is in dynamical connection with it. It does not resemble the object, but has a real connection with it. Here the fingerprint, and most generally the trace, which Roland Barthes calls a bit of information used to identify or pinpoint certain elements of time and space. If Frankel's analogy is correct, the imaginary or archetypal identity document thus triangulates the system of signification that underpins the field of modern semiology as such. It is appropriate history is not simply the history of the emergence and use of any particular document, the passport, the police, FIC, badge, the register, but also the practical history of the signs that have come to comprise documentary identification as such, but also the practical history of the signs that have come to comprise documentary identification as such. In a brilliant analysis, Frankel demonstrates how only an examination of the intricate history of the signature is able to disclose its combined character as symbol, icon, and trace, even though in its modern form it conserves only its character as trace. Arguably, The trace is in fact the privileged sign of modern identity, with the fingerprint having become the unofficial emblem of modern identity culture. For all practical purposes, qualitatively unique, yet capable of being enrolled in a numerical series for the purpose of classification, retrieval, and communication. The fingerprint also symbolizes the police and criminological procedures that often threaten to occupy the entire field of identification as a theme of historical research. However, it is important also to yield space to civil and legal practices beyond the limits of the criminal law alone, since they also throw up problems of recognition and verification that only sometimes fall under the purview of criminal law, strictly speaking. For as the elements of identity come to be objectified and situated in a legal matrix, so issues of stabilization, property, and alienability are thrown up. How are the elementary signs of identity stabilized as legal and practical objects? How do they come to have a recognized official status? Conversely, by what legal means, if any, can a person be said to own or have rights over the signs and mechanisms of their identity, their name, image, handwriting, or indeed their physical body? How might we trace the historical dialectic between the claim to an identity, the disguise of a person, and the forgery of a document? How these issues were matters of legal as well as forensic discussion in the 19th century Europe, and constitute the matrix in which contemporary discourse of identification was shaped. In the remainder of this essay, I concentrate on the personal name as a component of the apparatus of identification. I begin by very briefly outlining the main themes in the history of the stabilization of personal names in Western Europe, and then look at the process by which the name was forced into contention as a legal object in the 19th century France, Germany, and England. Now, what I will not do is go too deeply into the comparative aspects of France, England, and Germany and their concept of naming. So what I will do is read the next section, which is called the stabilizing the name, and then go right to the conclusion. Again, for any of those that are interested in the book, it's right there. This is the book. Documenting Individual Identity, edited by Jane Kaplan and John Torpy. This specific essay is entitled This or That Particular Person, and it is written by Jane Kaplan herself, or itself. Jane can be a man's name. Haven't you ever seen, what's that fucking shit called? Firefly. Anyway, Documenting Individual Identity, edited by Jane Kaplan and John Torpy. Go to your library, go to your university library, go to any university library that's a public institution, or go to Amazon if you would like to read it. Stabilizing the name. According to the author of a contemporary German legal text, the name, as the most important distinguishing feature among people, plays a decisive role wherever people are registered in books or files, or take part in various legal procedures. The task of the name is to guarantee, at least approximately, an exact identification of the person. This renders it the object of legal regulation, especially of the law and public order, and thus also makes it into a legal instrument. This is a modern legal view of the matter, and its perspective is, from the point of view of the historian, somewhat one-sided. It is not simply the identificatory precision. It is not simply the identificatory precision of the name that makes it into legal object, but also the law itself that demands and imposes this precision, and to that extent creates the name as a means of identification. The legal seizure of the personal name in Europe is a recent and highly uneven development that followed centuries of stabilization by usage and custom alone. A brief and inadequate conspectus on the emergence in Western Europe of the contemporary conventional form of personal name, forename plus inherited surname, would note that the single name became the universal practice after the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, and the Roman Tria Nomina, or three-part name, and that as Christianity advanced, this was most commonly the baptismal name. From about the 11th century, a second name or surname began to be added, as a kind of adjective, modifying and extending the limited stock of baptismal names. Surnames are normally distinguished by genealogists and historians into 4 or 5 categories according to the type, that is, filiation, patronymic, place of origin, locative, object, toponymic, occupation, and sobriquet. But the process and pace by which surnames became inheritable, and hence more stable as family names, is not always easy to reconstruct. It clearly differed radically among regions and classes in response to the varieties of demographic growth. It clearly differed radically among regions and classes in response to the varieties of democratic growth, the elaboration of economic and property relations, and the expansion of written records. Precise pathways here were far from straightforward. Among the early medieval landholding class in England, for example, place names that may look like surnames were often descriptive of a current property and status only. New estates brought new names to the landholder, to his sons on dividing an inheritance or marrying an heiress. Thus, even after heritable patronymic surnames began to become more generally visible, roughly in the 13th and 14th centuries, their division was slow and uneven by region and class, and was subject to countervailing social and economic influences. In 16th century France, the easiest way to achieve ennoblement was to purchase a noble estate and assume its name. Similarly, in 18th century England, changes of surnames certified by Act of Parliament were allegedly common in order to comply with the terms of wills. These relatively fluid naming regimes reflected a system of distinction rather than identification, and in a culture of landed property and status, the title or honorific took precedence over the personal name of the upper classes. Moreover, the customary adjectival origin of the family name reminds us that it was the baptismal or sacramental name that was a person's more important name, his or her real name, both in canon law and in popular usage, until well into the 17th century. I'm receiving another phone call, it looks. Appears to be the case. Oh. It's a scam from Canton, Ohio. Home of the Football Hall of Fame. A scam coming from the home of the Football Hall of Fame. Wait. Is that Football Hall of Fame? Wait a minute. I have to look that up now. Yeah! Pro Football Hall of Fame. I got it in my head it might have been the Baseball Hall of Fame, which has this year denied Barry Bonds placement. To which I'll say very little, because there are innumerable people who have been stating with vicious precision the matter at hand. Pardon the interruption by the Football Hall of Fame, who is not calling me. Stabilizing the name. Let's see. Surnames are normally distinguished. I don't remember where I was when they called me. So, according to the author of a contemporary German legal text, the name... Wait a minute. Oh, I'm right at the end of it. Rewind it if you want to see the other shit. These relatively fluid naming regimes reflected a system of distinction rather than identification. In a culture of landed property and status, the title or honorific took precedence over the personal name for the upper classes. Moreover, the customary adjectival origin of a family name reminds us that it was the baptismal or sacramental name that was a person's more important name, his or her real name, both in canon law and in popular usage, until well into the 17th century. Nevertheless, factors favoring the changeability of surnames were unable to impede an inexorable process toward their stabilization as heritable family names. The process was entangled in a combination of social pressures and changes. For example, the crystallization of a concept of the family that privileged genealogical identity, or the growing significance of movable over immovable property, and of legal and state enactments. Again, not going to read through the comparative. France, section on France discusses legal stabilization of the name. Not really fucking... In Germany, it discusses the contestation of public and private for... I'll read you the first line. Oh, no. Germany, contest of public and private. From the legal point of view, the name is both a private and public matter, and German 19th century theory and practice can be seen largely as a contest between these two arms of law as they evolved through the century. Who has rights vis-a-vis a person's name? And England, common law. Suffice it to say that the English state has no effective control over or stake in the stabilization of a person's name, which has long been regarded a matter of common law. As an English contemporary of Gierke put it in 1879, the law of surnames may be concisely stated, there is none at all. Going to head straight to the conclusion. I am aware that the rather esoteric legal career of the name that I have sketched here only scratches the surface of this topic, which itself is part of the larger social, cultural, and linguistic history of names. The stabilization of names in any particular historical context depended on much more than just legislative enactment or official procedures. It was affected, for example, not only by the changes in the nature and extent of private property and the expansion of legal transactions, but by processes such as the growth of literacy and the stabilization of orthography. The subjective relationship between individuals and their names has also been subtly modified as names came to be uttered not just in a small circle of family and friends, but in the wider world of official and paper transactions, where the written or signed name might appear either as an alienation or a threat, or as a confirmation of identity. The linking of names to number, or the outright substitution of one for the other, school number, conscription or matriculation number, prison number, may open a further existential gap in the sense of self. Conscription numbers. That's what they call them. This, at least, is reflected in the stern warning issued by the captain to his servant, Mrs. Chirk, in Dennis's Cards of Identity. A warning that positions the state as the benign guardian of its citizens' failing sense of self. You must try and understand that the old days are over. The days when you could take your identity for granted. Nowadays, all the old means of self-recognition have been swept away, leaving even the best people in the state of personal dubiety. Very wisely, governments all over the world have sought to stop this rot before the entire human population has been reduced to anonymous grains. They give you cards on which they inscribe in capital letters the name which your fading memory supplies. They give you cards on which they inscribe in capital letters the name which your fading memory supplies before it is too late. It is their hope that by continually reading and rereading your name, you will be able to keep your hold on a past that no longer exists, and thus bring an illusion of self into the present. What I want to emphasize is this. Don't lose your name again, Mrs. Chirk. Don't at least lose the cards on which that name is written. On the largest and most profound scale, finally, you need to look to structural processes in the history of state formation and law, to account for the national differences outlined in this essay. Thus, in France, the drive toward centralization began under early modern absolutism, even before it was pushed forward with such energy by the revolutionary and republican regimes after 1789. Germany's history of particularism, Prussianism, and the reception of Roman law produced a complex mix of state practices, was further disturbed by the late 19th century processes of central state formation and legal codification. In England, local and parliamentary government placed limits on the reach of the bureaucratic state and the elaboration of governmental science, with the result that experiments in these fields were displaced to more tractable colonial territories, notably Ireland and British India. But these grand political narratives of territorial sovereignty and the formation of the nation-state not only depended upon the technical capacity to establish and administer systems of identification and control, but in certain respects the history of these apparatuses is such. The state, as an institution, constituted itself in the fragmented and multifarious processes of its administrative activities. That, documenting individual identity, edited by Jane Kaplan and John Torpy. I have one more reading to do for you guys. Before you discuss the farmer's wife's pet goat one more time. I said that on purpose. You know what I'm talking about. Now, this next book is written by an author that I have discussed on numerous occasions. And it's a book that I found to be relatively refreshing in terms of its, especially after fucking years of reading extremely dry nerd shit, while also sort of bearing the mark of wizardry of every other culture and media studies documented book I've read. It's Telesthesia. Communication, Culture, and Class by Dr. Mackenzie Wark of the New School. Now, as any culture and media studies student, professor, scholar does, I'm simply taking things that are useful to me and then declaring them to be part of what I'm doing and part of my body and referencing them as such. So this book has in it a number of essays that deal with a variety of topics. This is a bit of a, what do they call them, compilation of essays. However, rather than being a compilation of essays, by a number of authors on a single topic, a compilation of essays by a single author on a number of different topics, which is sort of what authors also do sometimes. Now, according to this book, when was this released? This book was released in published in 2012. It's a Polity Press out in Cambridge and Malden, Massachusetts. I'll be reading two essays from this. one of which popped into my head recently in its relation to another set of ideas that I'd already explored as well, toward which I was pushed by another professor at the school, who wrote an essay about something completely different, well, relatively different, but had everything to do with sort of getting me into the direction that this essay happens to sit as well. I have yet to remember the name of the essay that this other professor wrote, and also this essay happens to be a relatively solid sugar cube into which you can toss into your fucking bitter ass coffee to keep you from sitting and making whinging ass faces at me while you drink, because you're trying to push away the internalized shame that I'm currently pedagogically implanting into your consciousness. The first essay from this book that I will be reading is called Game and Play in Everyday Life. Game and Play in Everyday Life. It is chapter 9, spelled N-I-N-E. 9. Fucking. Has your life become a game of chance? This is a headline I found once in Time magazine. The story begins. The people in Washington have turned your life into a series of spins of the wheel that begin with daycare and end with retirement. Washington has structured the game just as any gambling house would, so there are a few winners, but a lot more losers. This is just the first in a long series I could assemble of instances in which we talk about life as if it had become a game. These days, the game is everywhere and nowhere, overflowing the special times and places that once defined it as a game. Take, for instance, the sustained popularity of reality TV shows, where reality is presented as if it were a game. On Average Joe, regular guys compete against each other, and then against hunks for the affections of a cheerleader. On The Apprentice, entrepreneurs and B-school types compete to be Donald Trump's minion. As Breton and Cohen write, by manufacturing game worlds into which they slot their non-actor casts, creating pressurized and untested environments where people are manipulated in cruel and extreme ways and begin to display the confusion and loss of perspective of the incarcerated, these productions use their power without adequate or sufficiently transparent checks and safeguards. That sounds like a description of everyday life. Warfare seems more and more like a game. In his memoir of the First Gulf War, General Schwarzkopf tells the story about running simulations of the war before it began, using, as it turns out, the same commercial simulation software as the Iraqis. Simulations continued after Operation Desert Shield commenced. Schwarzkopf recounts having the communiques labeled. What? Schwarzkopf recounts having the communiques labels actual and simulation, so that he and his staff could tell them apart. Of course, theory seems more and more of a game. Just as athletes have their signature moves, so too does Slavoj Žižek. Fucking Žižek. I don't know how to pronounce your first name, sir. His opening move for playing the theory game is to flip conventional wisdom over and read it backwards. Here's an example. His opening move for playing the theory game is to flip conventional wisdom over and read it backwards. Here's an example. It is not the fantasy of a purely aseptic war run as a video game behind computer screens that protects us from the reality of the face-to-face killing of another person. On the contrary, it is this fantasy of a face-to-face encounter with an enemy killed bloodily that we construct in order to escape the real of the depersonalized war turned into an anonymous technological operation. I think he has something there, but the Zizekian move can just as easily be applied to what theorists do. It is not the fantasy of theory, it's just the language game that protects it from doing real work on real stuff. It is the fantasy of real work and real stuff that protects us from the real that scholarship is just a language game. And so everything appears as if it were a game. Everyday life, working life, warfare, knowledge, perhaps even love. And when we fail at any of these relentless zero-sum competitions, we can flee to Vegas and put our trust into another kind of game, where luck rather than competition rules. These experiences seem disturbingly like George Perec's dystopian novel W. The book is a memoir of Perec's childhood, hiding from the Nazis, within which he also reconstructs his childhood fantasy of a seemingly utopian island called W, which is organized around a complete devotion to an Olympic spirit of sporting competition. As Perec's account of W unfolds, we discover more and more of a dark side to its Olympian ideals. W's athletes compete not to win, but to live. W seems less and less to describe the logic of games, but more of the camps, both of which in Perec's book end up being the same thing. If one is worth nothing more than one's rank against a competitor, one is eventually worth nothing. The competitive life is a living death. The critical literature on games is not very extensive, and indeed, Perec's novel is better than some. On the theory front, there are 4 classics worth mentioning. 2 of them are Johann Huizinga's holy shit, Homo Ludens, and Roger Calois' Man Playing Games, both rather eccentric books. The 3rd and 4th, even stranger, I will come back to later. From Huizinga's, we might take the idea that play is a primary category. While games formalize and regulate play, they may also reduce it to repetition. Games may be play in its decadent form. From Calois, we take the idea that there are different types of games. He offers 4-part classification: agon, alea, mimesis, or illings, or games of competition, of luck, of make-believe, and of vertigo. Writing in the context of post-war reconstruction, Calois has a strong preference for agon and alea, which are games of luck and competition, and sees mimesis and illings as dangerous forms of play because they lack strong rules and limits. Games of make-believe and vertigo are viewed as dangerous forms of play because they lack strong rules and limits. For Calois, the roots of fascism are in play without limits. In our time, a world made up of games of agon and alea, fucking Christ, seems actually to have been realized, but in somewhat uneven fashion. For the emerging ruling class, the game is a game of competition. For the rest of us, it is a game of luck. As the Time article suggests, we play a game we cannot master, never quite knowing the rules. The critical preference of Calois for the strongly rule-bound game over the free and open play was reversed in the 60s. In the United States, the New Games movement produced games of minimal rules aimed at creating cooperative play. Earthball would be a perfect example. Bernard de Koven came up with the idea of the well-played game. Even competitive games only work if the players cooperate on playing well. Playing well has to be the general state. In Europe, a more sustained critique emerged out of a rereading of Huizinga, George Bataille, Marx, and the historic avant-garde of Dada and Surrealism. For Guy Debord, the leader of the Situationists, the revolutionary task was to make the entire space of the city a space for play, overthrowing the alienating division between work and leisure. For his sometimes ally Constant, that's a person, that's a name, the goal was the construction of whole new urban structures for facilitating play, a project he called New Babylon. Both were influenced by the reading of Huizinga and Calois, to be found in the work of Henri Lefebvre, who took everyday life to be a domain within which groups sallied forth and challenged each other. For Lefebvre, the challenge was to modern life what the gift was to the ancients. Now is a good time to revisit this critical tradition, which makes play a central category in the critique of the military. Nope. Wait. Now is a good time to revisit this critical tradition, which makes play a central category in the critique of the military entertainment complex, which calls it to account for its corruption of everyday life with the game. If you'd like to explore the concept of the military entertainment complex, I highly recommend you pick up the book. Which calls it to account for its corruption of everyday life with the game. Which calls it to account for its corruption of everyday life with the game. Against Calwell, we might argue that the problem is not too few rule-bound games, but too many of them. There's no longer any escape or retreat from an all-inclusive game space. Against the 60s play radicals, we might argue that play doesn't exist in its pure form. The being of the game and the becoming of play produce each other. In other words, we might generalize Derrida's argument in structure, sign, and play. If the emphasis has to fall somewhere, however, it is best to treat play as the primary category, and game as the supplement. Brian Masumi's Parables of the Virtual is useful here. The game is not the condition of existence of play, but vice versa. If play is pure difference, the game marks and sorts play into differences that differentiate according to the same principle. Masumi's example is soccer. Play itself is a flux that ripples through the field and cannot be neatly distributed into objects and subjects. But play always comes to rest in digital result. The ball is in or not. The ball is in or out. The player offsides or not. The team scores or doesn't. The game is a space in which becoming is reduced to being, flux to neat divisions between subjects and objects. One plays not only as an interface. One plays not only at an interface, but as an interface. This is an elusive point, but a key one. It helps us understand why games are the form culture assumes in the digital age. We live in an era when a new ruling class is emerging, one that requires a new form of private property, no longer tracts of land or factories and inventories, but what the Rax Media Collective calls rainforests of ideas. As Stephen Shaviro writes, digitization goes hand in hand with privatization. It's our version of what Marx calls primitive accumulation. The emergence of the intensive vector of the digital, but in particular the digital constrained within the bounds of property and strategy, is what lies behind the proliferation of the game, or more particularly, of the game as Agon, a game of competition, and Elea, a game of luck. As Jackson Lears argues in his book Something for Nothing, there has always been a tension in American culture between games of competition and games of luck, between predestination and the luck of the gods, between Protestant and animist. What we see in our time is that the games of competition and games of luck move, in Raymond Williams' terms, from being residual to dominant cultural forms. This is because we are at a point where the homology between property, strategy, and digital becomes the basis for the whole organization of life. That every aspect of being should be bounded, discrete, and finite is the order of the day. The chessboard or the tennis court are the models for the digital world, only now coming into being as the third nature, a general and abstract space, a universal game space. The lines aren't drawn in powdered chalk on the freshly cut lawn. They are drawn invisibly by global positioning satellites. For what is GPS if not the very surface of the planet itself as a total chessboard? Every inch rendered discrete, finite, and bounded. The surface of the earth is no longer a topography, a space of writing, of maps and titles. It is a topology, the space of the logos itself, if of a somewhat limited and particular kind. The whole surface of the globe becomes a game space, or rather two overlaid and overlapping game spaces, of commodity space and strategy space, of desire and security. There is a strategy space and a commodity space. We are living through an era in which this strategy space dominates. The invasion of Iraq might stand as an emblem of it, But under the Clinton administration, to which some look back with nostalgia, what we may have seen is really just the predominance of the commodity space, otherwise known as the level playing field of the free market economy. It caused something of a sensation when the United States Army started using an online computer game as a recruiting tool. Oh, you guys. You can download the first-person shooter America's Army free from the internet. What is less noticed is how games allegorize the ideological kernel of game space as a way of life into other areas of the everyday. It is not violence that is intrinsic to games, but the logic of the digital, of difference restricted to the discrete and finite. Defenders of games sometimes point to non-violent games like The Sims as evidence that game culture cannot be reduced to the question of violence. I'll read that again, ladies and gentlemen. Defenders of games sometimes point to non-violent games like The Sims as evidence that game culture cannot be reduced to the question of violence. But maybe what is of more interest is what America's Army and The Sims have in common: the collapsing the whole of life into the digital, and the extension of the principles of the digital to the whole of life. Spoiler alert! Orson Scott Card's sci-fi novel Ender's Game is a favorite with military simulation types, and no wonder. It's a novel about training children to fight some alien enemy, and the story of one child in particular brutalized by boot camp, then sent to playing endless simulated wars on computer games against the aliens. Only it turns out it was no simulation. What the child thinks was the training exercise was the war. And it is the war. The form of the digital game, irrespective of content, is now the form of everyday life itself. Now, I don't want to suggest that all games are a bad thing. Rather, I want to return to Huizinga's line of inquiry as to whether a given game culture is an enabler of play in its protean creative sense, or if it is a decadent form that merely induces play to repetition. This is where the question of property comes back into focus. Marx once said that the people make history, but not with the means of their own choosing. Now one might say the people create play, but not in games of their own choosing. Games, when they become decadent, trap play and repeat it as endless variations of the same. Or, one might say, a decadent game extends the digital to the point that it excludes any other kind of difference. Writing in the 1950s, situationists thought that play offered some kind of critical leverage against social factory, against the extension of the commodity form to the whole of everyday life. They invented practices of play in and against the city, as a step toward the imagining of a new city, built for less mediocre games. What they had not foreseen was that play of this kind could be captured and made functional component of commodification. Rather than being a process that invents new forms, play is now captured and made functional for the same forms, over and over. The forms of commodity space and strategy space. The analog of play calls into being the digital of the game. But the question is whether the digital then suppresses or enables difference. The question, then, is whether the digital then suppresses or enables difference. The space within which the situationists discovered new possibilities of play was an addressable space. The space of the city. Children of the war years, they knew all about aerial surveillance and its consequences, and yet they discovered play not only within, but also against an addressable space. The wager of 21st century avant-gardes is that the addressable spaces of the extensive vectors can also be spaces of play, both in and against the digital. Henry Jenkins famously celebrates play within the space of what he calls convergence culture. Culture industry artifacts, whether fantasy novels, TV series, games, or comics, become the raw material for the creation of new stories, or of the communities in which the consumer becomes the producer. But is this not just the vulture industry at work? The vulture industry. The vulture industry. Parallel to the outsourcing of producing the hardware to China is the insourcing of the production of content to the leisure hours of their own consumers. This is play in the space of the vector, but not against it. A little different is the path that stretches from the electronic disturbance theater and eToy to 4chan, Anonymous, LulzSec, WikiLeaks, and other more or less anonymous pseudonymous, good God, pseudonymous groups who, like the Situationists, play in and against addressable space. Kawal was right to warn against the dangers of the fantasy of pure play and the pure play of fantasy. Play does not know when to stop. As anyone who has been around small children has surely discovered, his privileging of games of chance and games of competition over games of make-believe and vertigo seems particularly aimed at George Bataille, who even in the post-war period was still hankering after rituals that could abolish the self and touch the absent presence of the absolute. But, on the other hand, Calwa did not foresee the opposite danger, that the bounds and limits of the game would come to coexist via digital technicity with a regime of property, and that this game space would become a totality. The online version of The Sims was not popular, at least in part because the newbie players were treated as marks by griefers who scammed them the minute they entered the game. The con, who cheats in real-life games, is a persona who advances along the lines of a vector. The mark is named after Ben Marks, who invented the Big Store Con, using fake storefronts in frontier railway towns. Graham Parker, according to Graham Parker, or quoted from Graham Parker, the stores thrived in the heyday of the American railroads and had a symbiotic relationship with the burgeoning infrastructure as it sped across America. Marx was the first criminal to advance the mobile parasitic logic of the railroad grafter to match the ambitions of the host. The difference between game space as it is coming to being in reality and the ideology of the game is that in the ideology game space is a level playing field where the fittest survive. In actual game space, the big players have the umpire in their pocket. Exploitation today is a matter of meeting our opponents as if on a level playing field, where they can change the rules to suit themselves. This is the meaning of deregulation. But the state is no longer even notionally the empire. The umpire. This became particularly clear after the 2008 financial crisis. Most of the banks were bailed out on a largely no-questions-asked basis, while ordinary mortgage holders received only token assistance. Bet $100,000 on your house and lost, you were just a mark who lost. Bet a few $100 million on a mortgage-backed security, your bad bet was covered. David Graeber points out that historically debt crises are solved at the expense of debt holders, so that the economic activity can resume again. This was not the case in Europe or the United States after 2008. The bondholders ruled. Two productive factions of the vectorial class, the strategic and the logistic, were held hostage by a third, which uses power of the vector to secure control of flows, not only of money in all its forms, but flows of information about values. Imagine you were playing a video game. There are things to avoid in this game, and things to find. Some things lower your score, and some raise it. The only problem is, your opponent knows where they are, and what their value is before you do. Worse, your opponent is your source of information about some of those values, and might not always tell you straight. The decadence of the overdeveloped world is this gaming of the game. It is as if the ball boys and umpires all had bets on a match and acted in their own interests, not in the interests of the game. Leonard Cohen called it. Everybody knows the dice are loaded. We all roll with our fingers crossed. That's from the song Everybody Knows by Leonard Cohen. Two politics of the game suggest themselves. First, a reformist one, in which the state resumes its role as natural. The state resumes its role as natural empire of the game, One accepts the enclosure of the commons in strategy space and commodity space, but insists that the major players play the game by the same rules as everyone else. One should not be able to attack other countries unprovoked unless the UN allows it. The financial wing of the vectorial class ought not to game the game in its own interests and at the expense of creative investment. In this vision, play is still subordinated to the game. There's a crow outside my window. History becomes a matter of ever-expanding and ever-deepening game space that is called upon to coincide with its own ideology. There may be another vision in which the digital is freed from its identity within property, and the capacity to create game spaces becomes the new commons. Play, freed from a tyrannical and falsely universal game space, might then revert to the role of Huizinga always thought it should have. Play, freed from a tyrannical and falsely universal game space, might then revert to the role of Huizinga always thought it should have, as the engine of difference, oscillating between antipodes, the means of production of difference itself. The Occupy Wall Street events of 2011 might be thought of as just such a play, not to mention on a vaster scale the occupation of Tahrir Square in Egypt that preceded them. These were occupations not just of concrete places but of abstract ones as well, situations in which a commons appeared, at least for a while. Of course, it is all about the end game in such circumstances. What counts are the moves after such openings. And in these and many other cases, game space trumped open play in the end. But still, one can't but keep trying. The great game isn't Afghanistan anymore, although that is part of it. The game space is the game against those who would game space itself, and put an end to that play which invents new rules. So far I've been looking at game space from above, as it were, like aerial surveillance. But what does it feel like to roll with your fingers crossed? A terrific example of the phenomenology of play is a book by David Sudnow called Pilgrim in the Microworld. It is the third of our classic texts. A former ethnomethodologist, Sudnow found himself for obscure reasons outside the profession of sociology, making a living as a piano teacher. He even had his own distinctive method for this. Pilgrim in the Microworld is as detailed and nuanced an ethnography of the experience of play, and of one's relation to play in a digital world as one could hope for, but it stays close to experiential frame. This offers a point of departure for taking the point of view of the gamer seriously, for working out from it, grasping from the whole landscape of the military entertainment complex from the point of view of one of the key personas that it has called into being. Sudnow chronicles step by step how he became a gamer. The story of how he internalizes the goals of the game itself, how he trains his senses, and tunes his motor skills into his senses, and his senses into the feedback loop of the game, none of which is a conscious action, like learning the piano. It's a kind of athletics, shaping of the nerves and muscles, of carving neural pathways to speed the interaction of human and inhuman circuits. It's about training in cycles of effort and reward, where these cycles become predictable loops. The gamer lives for quantifiable rewards. The persona, or rather the interface of the gamer, is the carapace which makes this training appear meaningful to the awareness of the body so trained. The fourth classic book about games, alongside Sudnow, Kalwan, Huizinga, is surely Bernard Suit's The Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia. It addresses that gamer awareness, and asks about a larger reward for play than a score within a game. Somewhat more startling is that this utopia is described by the fabled grasshopper of the title, rather by the acolytes of the grasshopper. The grasshopper preferred to play rather than to store up food for the winter and died. The students are ants who attempted to reconstruct his Socratic dialogues, like so many insect Platos. Already, in Suits, there's a sense that the good life is at some remove. In the overdeveloped world, it seems that if one were to rewrite this work, it would have had to be the other way around. It is the ants that die, and we are all grasshoppers. Play is all we consume, even as play consumes us. Perhaps this striking work is now from another time. According to Galloway and Thacker, networks involve a shift in scale, one in which the central concern is no longer the action of the individuated agents or nodes in a network. Instead, what matters more and more is the varied distribution and dispersal of action throughout the network. What is called for are personas which, unlike the ant and the grasshopper, don't return back to the integrity of a whole body on the one hand, but the technology on the other. Rather, personas are specific, local, non-phenomenological. Critical theory has learned to embrace a range of personas. It came to terms with its own petite bourgeois. Critical theory has learned to embrace a range of personas. It came to terms with its own petite bourgeois origins once it did not identify itself automatically with the party of the working class. It broke out of an anodyne humanism to understand a variety not only of class personas but those of gender, race, and sexuality. But why stop there? Why not embrace also those personas thrown up late in modernity? Why not embrace those that are not personas relating subjects to each other, but subjects and objects, interfaces? Two interfaces come into mind as particularly interesting: the gamer and the hacker. Both are products of the military entertainment complex. Both engage centrally with questions of play. The hacker still has remnants of the romantic idea of free creative play that invokes its own rules. The gamer as an interface has the virtue of stepping away from such an idea of an interface as a self-acknowledged legislator. The gamer plays within the game as given. The gamer is an antipodal figure, playing against the game from within. Gamer and hacker are the interfaces advocated by Kalwa and Huizinga respectively. Each has something to say to the other. The game as end itself can become decadent. The gamer narrowly focused, perhaps tempted to cheat, to game the game. The hacker, on the other hand, has a tendency to ramble, to head off into the wilderness, to become unbounded from the constraints that shape play's anti-productivity in a paradoxically productive direction. This would be to move in the contrary direction, to the now established field of game studies, which takes its cue from the work of Ian Bogost, under the banner of proceduralism. Bogost rightly insists that games are defined by their unique formal properties. Whatever values a game communicates are embedded in the design of the procedures for playing it. This has the effect, however, of privileging the game designer as the author of the rule set and the procedures it generates. Bogost takes a step forward in identifying the formal qualities of the game, but a step backwards receiving the persona of its author. Needless to say, game designers are attracted to the procedural point of view, even if it aligns them with other servants of vectoral power as architects of game space rather than collaborators in that practice that would try to game the system or hack it. We shall see soon enough who has history on their side. That's the end of the game and play in everyday life. And now the last essay of the day. This is probably my favorite one, for reasons that shouldn't be unclear. And I highly recommend you do not skip a real listen to the entirety of today's essays, such that you can figure the fucking shit out and then really, really begin to internalize that horrific and painful shaming that my pedagogy is intended on producing within you. Which, if you were a good student, would begin to take real, solid structural form and crystallize within you towards the end of this essay, if not having already done so. This is chapter 17. The little sisters are watching you. One by one, the eyes of the big brothers are closed and coins placed over them. While a third generation of Kim family dictators is groomed to take over the family business of ruling North Korea, enough portraits of Saddam Hussein and Colonel Gaddafi went to the pyre to increase global warming. You want me to read that, Sandy? While a third generation of Kim family dictators is groomed to take over the family business of ruling North Korea, enough portraits of Saddam Hussein and Colonel Gaddafi went into the pyre to increase global warming. Now there's a more subtle and effective image of omnipotence, more consonant with the minutiae of present-day consumption. The little sisters are watching you, staring out at you from billboards, magazines, screens large and small. Behind the production of her image is not some quirky dictator and his nervous minions, but a small army of agents, stylists, hairdressers, photographers, and of course models. The whole industries exist to find and groom actual bodies. Whole industries exist to find and groom actual bodies that might embody this abstract interface, who is one of the central modes of the contemporary imaginal world. She has a privileged place within the world that telesthesia reveals. She won't send the secret police to kick in your door in the middle of the night, but she might send you to the mall to get new shoes, and quite possibly in your sleep. Let's call her the girl. Let's call her the girl. She hasn't much to do with actual women, although women might or might not feel obliged to mark their distance from her. The girl is not even necessarily female or even all that young. Sometimes men's bodies, or older bodies, populate the images that constitute her. She isn't always white, she isn't always human. Sometimes she's a robot, or a cartoon, or a flower. What norms around which she gravitates are geometrical. The girl is a curious kind of interface. One can inhabit the interface of the gamer or the hacker, but the girl is more elusive. She is rather like the interface of the child with whom our tour of the panorama of telesthesia begin. She enables certain flows of image and story access to some parts of your awareness, rather than allowing your awareness to access certain parts of the knowable world. Perhaps, like the image of the child, the image of the girl is a sort of non-persona. She makes the inhuman look like something approachable. In 2005, the Svedka Vodka Company started using a fembot as its public face. Designed by Stan Winston, who worked on Aliens, Avatar, and the Terminator movies, the fembot is an apparently female robot who stares out of billboards under punning signs such as, "Are you bought or not?" The ad on the sign of buses has her reclining with the slogan, "The Ultimate Party Machine." As is often the case, the advertising here is not being in any sense false. It is quite candid about the fact that the girl is not only not a woman, but is not even human. Make an ex-trophy wife 100% titanium. The publicists for Svedka assured us it's all meant in a playful spirit. All the good ones are married and gay. Play would hardly exempt them from the charge of promoting a certain misogyny, even if what is more striking is the campaign's frank acknowledgement that the desires the girl massages are hardly even human. The girl is the marker of the success and failure of feminism. Like most social movements, feminism's gains come at the price of certain incorporation into the very order it opposes. The women's liberation movement begat, as an unintended consequence, girl power. As the anonymous writers of Tikkun have it, the supposed liberation of women has not consisted in their emancipation from domestic sphere, but rather the extension of that sphere over the whole of society. Life in the Get in the fucking fishbowl, you little shitbag. Life in the overdeveloped world is not a social factory, but a social boudoir. It even extends itself into the workplace, which now harbors rituals of tact and gesture of discretion that would be worthy of a Proust, but which will have to settle for being chronicled by the screenwriters of Sex and the City. Labor became affective labor. Politics became family drama. Art became interior decoration. The struggle over the remaking of the form of social life became kitchen renovation. For actual women, perhaps not just for women, the girl is an interface that can't be occupied, for which one has to negotiate somehow, but with which someone has to negotiate somehow. The movie of The Devil Wears Prada addresses this by splitting the problem between four characters who manage the distance between body and interface in different ways. When Anne Hathaway joins the staff of a voguish magazine, she finds herself a third of a series of satellites. One will become her gay confidant, Stanley Tucci. One her female rival, Emily Blunt. Three of them orbit the devil herself, the editor, Meryl Streep. Blunt tries too hard to be the girl. Many not bad jokes here about how she starves herself. Tucci as the gay confidant is always the bridesmaid, never the bride to the girl. Hathaway has to resolve the confusion of whether to be the girl or to wield the girl, which is the secret of Meryl, the devil. In the end, she quits to go to work for a magazine more like The Nation. Her flirtation with being or doing the girl is over. It's a wannabe Bildungsroman. Why? About the difference between being and the interface. The images of the girl are currency through which a modification in the world of images is managed and felt. The omnipresence of the girl only shows that the myth of the intimacy of woman with nature has found a new home, that of second nature, which is now apparently a domestic world of finishes and veneers. Jean Baudrillard. This is called information, and it has wormed its way into everything like a phobic, maniacal leitmotif, which affects sexual relations as well as kitchen implements. The domestic world of second nature is impregnated with significance. The girl presides over the communicability of surfaces. The girl's utopia is domestic, but the domicile of the domestic is imagined as the whole world. The girl will save that world by being photographed offering food to needy children somewhere, being photographed with a product, some tiny percentage of the proceeds of which was sent to someone else, over there to feed them. She never appears as a mother. The girl does not have children of her own, but her interface forms a pact with other interfaces, including on occasion the child. Pictures show supermodel Tasha de Vasconcelos visiting a clinic in Malawi. Visiting the clinic in Malawi that she helped set up. She is of course pictured holding the black child. Or a supermodel vows to stay naked till USAID funds reach starving children. A supermodel, incidentally, is just a model who became famous for impersonations of the girl. Going naked would be the appropriate kind of strike for someone paid to put on the girl as appearances. The girl can be nude but never naked. The effective tone of the girl ranges from friendly to sexy, from pliable to indomitable. Her look can be inviting or a fuck-off stare. Her face is never a Jane face, Google it, but often pictures the moment before or after. She is not always available, but she might be available to be available. Just as there is a range of affect, so too there is a range of decor. She can be on the street, in an office, in the boudoir, or even on the moon. The girl makes every scene an interior, as if any place in the world could be made her private domain by her presence. Her power is to create this domain as beauty. Her power to create this domain is beauty. She is sequestered in her own beauty. A certain moralizing tone in contemporary discourse holds somewhat paradoxically that beauty is only skin deep, and what matters is really inner beauty. But as with the Greeks, the world of the girl regards beauty as having both spiritual and philosophical import. According to Debord, what is good appears. What appears is good. The good that appears, beauty, is outside of time. Experience, aging, procreation, memory, in short, history, is not to appear. Time is marked out by structural permutations of the fashion cycle. Fashion has nothing to hide but its recent past. The girl is quite naturally not just about beauty, but also about sex. Rather, she's about a sexiness detached from any particular sex act. Since Monet's Olympia, the girl has had an embarrassing relation to the specifics of sex, not to mention the specifics of money. She's not supposed to be locatable in any particular intercourse of either kind. That's why in a world apparently of so laissez-faire about desires, porn is, with few exceptions, a domain cordoned off from the world of legitimate models and actresses. The exceptions, such as porn star turned actor Sasha Grey, confirm the rule on closer analysis. The exceptions, such as porn star turned actor Sasha Grey, confirm the rule on closer analysis. The girl is about seduction more than sex. She appears to be practicing seduction without any specific person in mind. She makes seduction a constant. She appears as the bearer of an apparently esoteric knowledge of what it is to be wanted. Baudrillard, the irony proper to the constitution of the girl, as an ideal or sex object in her close perfection, she puts an end to sex play and refers men, the lord and master of the sexual reality, to his transparency as an imaginary subject. This might be the untapped potential of the girl, her antipodal relationship to the whole dichotomy of the gendered imaginary. This might be the untapped potential of the girl, her antipodal relation to the whole dichotomy of the gendered imaginary. But it is not the use to which she is put. According to Baudrillard, in advertising, it is not so much a matter of adding sex to washing machines, which is absurd, as conferring on objects the imaginary female quality of being available at will, of never being retractile or aleatory. The girl seduces on behalf of a brand or a product, or sometimes even a cause. Somebody was paid to embody or invoke her, and assume the aura of seduction on behalf of shampoo or champagne. Yet there is a certain mobility, yet there is a certain nobility about the girl, which is not supposed to be questioned. She stands as embodied of beauty, on the one side for venal seduction, but on the other for romantic love. Love is the last unquestionable ideology. Laura Kipnis, consider that the most powerful organized religions produce an occasional heretic. According to Laura Kipnis, is a quote, consider that the most powerful organized religions produce the occasional heretic. Every ideology has its apostates. Even sacred cows find their butchers, except for love. After the death of God comes the death of the Oedipal father figures who are his stand-ins, including Big Brother. No third term mediates on that behalf of the symbolic order any more between the self and what appears to it. Yet romantic love lives on. Pop songs still speak endlessly of it, declaring their loves to you. The you addressed in pop songs is the girl. It does not replace the father and his stand-ins looking down from above. She is in several senses a bit on the side, but not above the subject and the object. Between, but not above, the subject and the object. There's a certain tension in this interface. The girl has to embody, at the one hand, has to embody, at one and the same, a romantic love between banal and self-involved, and a beauty between seamless and sheer. The domesticity of sharing toothpaste and the domesticity of beauty in photoshopped splendor tend to cancel each other out. As Tikkun might say, her love, like her ass, is an abstraction. Love and beauty are extracts, mined and circulated for purposes not intrinsic to themselves. The girl is only partly there as the object of desire, as stand-in for the commodity. According to Kuhn, the girl is the dominant social relationship, the central form of desire within the spectacle. The girl is the dominant social relationship, the central form of the desire within the spectacle. As Kojève parses Hegel, I don't desire the other as a thing. I desire the other's desire. Or to translate that into pop, I want you to want me. I need you to want me. The girl is a commodity that appears to desire its acquirer, or rather she might desire us. The suspension is key. The universal and eternal seduction projected by the girl might or might not alight specifically on us. She is available to be available, but she isn't cheap. quote, because I'm worth it. Incidentally, the slippage in slogans used by L'Oreal, from because I'm worth it to because you're worth it, to because we're worth it, might indicate a certain ambiguity as to who is worth what. Where and how is value created in this chain of production, seduction, and consumption? Pierre Klosowski once proposed the idea of living currency. What if one thought of the medium exchange of an economy not as a cold, hard cash, but as warm, fuzzy emotions? Bodily presence might already be a commodity, quite apart from any commodity it produces. Think of the shop assistant or waitress, standing around bored, waiting for customers. If it is an expensive store or bar, she will of course be beautiful. She will have to model. In a sense, she will embody the girl in vivo. She's not already a commodity. Is she not already a commodity, even before any customers walk in wanting frocks or cocktails? These bodies, waitress and drinker alike, both produce and are produced by an economy of sensations. They inhabit a world in which desires, emotions, and fantasies are exchangeable, if only for store credit. Klosowski draws an interesting distinction between fantasy and simulacrum. Fantasy is implicated in the real. It is not purely private and can involve others. Yet, fucking wake up. Yet, it is not exchangeable. It is fantasy in the sense that the surrealists thought it could be the raw material for political imagination. Simulacra, on the other hand, are exchangeable. They are what the velvet gold mine of the surrealists really turned out to be, the raw ore of commodified desire. Simulacra, in Klosowski's sense, are not the general equivalent that is represented by money, but currency of another species. Specific equivalents, represented as often as not by bodies, in particular by the body doubles of the girl. In Klosowski's economy, perhaps in our own way, fantasy and simulacrum are reversible as object and subject, and use value and exchange value. A simulacrum can have use value. It's the effective charge of the girl that is the use value consumed in the purchase and wearing of a shoe. In the words of Tikkun, the girl's ass represents the last bastion of the illusion of use value. The one constant is the push and pull of desire, the one remaining gold standard. The girl is the central embodiment of the golden standard of affect. Large-scale industrial production of the girl is a hedge against the depreciation of affect in the overdeveloped world. Not only is the symbolic order in decline, the imaginary machinery that replaces it requires constant salubrication. The girl returns to the sullied world of commodities their lost honor. Like gold, the girl radiates a certain rarity and uselessness. And, like gold, finding the raw awe out of which she is refined takes an industry of prospector. And like gold, the finding of the raw awe out of which she is refined takes an industry of prospectors. The personal is political. By this slogan, the women's movement sought to extend the image of the political into the domestic realm, to open it up to a certain critique and action. The political is personal. This is what the girl proposes by way of response. The political is personal. The social, communal, or political imaginal world is compressed into the personal domestic domain. Interestingly, it is this domestic domain at least partially imagined after feminism. But it is not a politics. It is not the effect of what Castoriadis calls the imaginary institution of society, rather of a simulated economy of desire. Little sister is watching you, or being watched by you, or encouraging you to join her in admiring something, maybe a bag or a watch. The domestic becomes the horizon of how life can be conceived. The four freedoms that might form the basis of imagining of politics in the overdeveloped world are 1. Freedom from religion. 2. Freedom from speeches. 3. Freedom from desire. And 4. Freedom from security. Of these, the third might seem the most puzzling. Surely the liberation of desire was one of the great themes of the 20th century. Surely freedom from religion is the freedom to desire. Wait, not so fast. There's a slippage here. It's true enough that freedom from religion was a partial achievement of modernity. What the psychoanalysts call the demise of symbolic efficiency really did take place. God is dead, and with him the law of the Father. The virulence with which religion returns in the overdeveloped world is a rearguard action. The megachurches spouting on the fringes of suburbia are centers of entertainment as much as anything else. God is undead. He is the living dead who passes out of the center of everyday life to stalk instead the fringes of its every night. But this partial disenchantment of the world leads not to the installment of rational enlightenment, but the installment of game space, where the meaning of value is its measure. And where that fails, new interfaces jostle the ghost-white father's side and take his place in the front ranks of our spectacular Olympus. One of his least expected rivals is the girl. She has few memorable biblical precedents, but her distant ancestors almost kept Odysseus from returning home. The girl is denominated not as the currency of faith, but of desire. She presides over the exchange of money not for things, but for the penumbra that surrounds things. She guarantees not the thing, but its aura. What is little noticed about Walter Benjamin's evocation of the aura is that it is about provenance. The aura of the artwork derives from the chain of title that guarantees its authenticity. In the absence of such a chain of title, the girl appears as the living currency that denominates a kind of alternative aura that can be drawn around even the most mass-produced of commodities. It might be just a thing made from raw materials shipped to China, run up in some giant factory and shipped by container over the seas, but it has been in the presence of the girl. Freedom from desire does not mean that, like the Taliban, one should ban the image of the girl or shut down the vector. Freedom from desire does not mean that, like the Taliban, one should ban the image of the girl or shut down the vector. Even that one should settle for the old petit bourgeois claim to be above all things, to shun fashion and read only good books. To abjure fashion is a move within its game. In literature, literature has been obsessed to abjure fashion is to move within its game, and literature has been obsessed with the problem of the girl for some time, on which see Madame Bovary. Rather, it's about asking Benjamin's question concerning the provenance of both the form and content of telesthesia. As Benjamin was already suggesting in the area of the mechanical reproducibility of the vector, it makes possible a kind of democratizing of perception, and along two axes. The vector becomes cheaper, less tied to exclusive rituals. Copies can be made for everybody. At the same time, the vector becomes a transopticon. In principle, at least, the scale of perception can be massively expanded. Different scales can be combined. Different time series can be organized, which expand or contract temporal perception. In short, montage means a vast expansion of temporal and spatial scales, of points of view, of possible networks of sense. Benjamin described the potentials of the Internet long before it existed. Benjamin was saying in effect that the transformation of the techno-economic base, the mode of production of perception, would change perception itself. And with his crude techno-Marxist insight, he was absolutely right. Only the transformation of the means of production is, as he was well aware, a site of struggle rather than a conveyor belt. The ruling class is not about to cede the socialization of the means of perception to popular forces without a fight, even if the maintenance of relations of private property in the domain of the production of perception requires the transformation of the composition of the ruling class itself, and a refashioning of its ideological superstructures. And so, in short, no more ritual of praying to the altar of the Father. No more great dictators offering the vanity of their mortal visage in its place. In place of the Father and Big Brother, the Little Sisters. Interestingly, they are not the daughters of the Father. Their origins, if they need not have any at all, are everyday. Every now and then, a backstory about the famous model with her ordinary middle-aged parents. The story might juxtapose portraits of the model with her family. A regular woman with her regular folks, with pictures of her at work. As a model, invoking the girl. The poses, the styling, the light, the framing, all will be significantly different. Her other parents are unseen except by their handiwork, the stylist, the makeup artist, photographer, photo editor, and so on. The girl is a belated retrieval of the value of provenance, and with it whole hierarchies of ownership and property in an overdeveloped world that long ago shot past the need for such things. So while desire was the great theme of the late 20th century, it ended up becoming nothing more than that which a new kind of currency, a living money, denominates. Not that there can't be wants and needs, yens and yearnings. Not that the everyday isn't full of moments of sexual hydraulics, for affect and intimacy, for seduction and surfaces. Only that the means are at hand to produce all of the above, whether in the most embodied or the most stylized form, at least partly outside of commodified desire. By the beginnings of the 21st century, the instinct of many of the second-wave feminists was to be wary of girl power, and rightly so. The girl stands for the slogan that the political is personal. It is about the freedom of desire to encase itself in the brands of its choice. So-called empowerment really meant credit cards. The problem was that retreating to an authenticity of the body, a refusal of seduction, or the insistence on difference just doesn't work. It's hard to make a stand on the body, or on its adequate representation, or on a practice of écriture féminine, when all of these kinds of things are already caught up in the vectoral. Third nature takes the cleavings of gender and distributes them all over the place. The antipodes of gender become an antipodality at work and at play, in any and every relation. Gender difference as the minimal unit of meaning becomes the guarantee of the possibility of meaning wherever a more rigorous game of algorithmic values can't be secured. Judith Butler made progress by insisting on the impossibility of a concordance of the body with that of what it is supposed to signify. But this openness to the performative quality of gender stops short of its detachment from subjects and distribution throughout the entire perceivable world. The girl is in a way subtracted from gender as a difference, and made to play as the token of a different kind of difference. Living money, the evaluation not even of things, but of market opportunities. This is why the interface of the drag queen doesn't really work to undo the apparent naturalness of gender. The drag queen has nothing to do with gender. She's all about the girl. The drag queen is the indication that not just technically male bodies, but anything at all, can be the support for the special effects of girlness. Even in the exaggerated form of drag, her effect works. She adds the provenance of living money to signs and things assembled and performed. The girl can be a man, but then the girl can be a robot, or even just the sign of a robot. The Svedka Fembot is even available as a Halloween costume, so that technically real women might masquerade as a robot pretending to be the girl. None of this ought to mean all that much when put up against the politics of domestic violence, rape, abortion, wage equality, sexual harassment at the workplace or on the street. The list goes on. Except that the girl is one of the things that stands in the way of there even being a politics within which such things could be the stakes. The girl-less living money of desire occludes the space for imagining a politics of wants and needs. But not only that, but the girl also effaced the possibility of another kind of aesthetics, or rather of another aesthetic economy, including that of seduction, that was actually based on the lack of provenance of the digital image, on the seemingly infinite flexibility of the vector within daily life. What if the girl also effaced the possibility of another kind of aesthetics, or rather of another aesthetic economy, including that of seduction, rather than of another aesthetic economy, including that of seduction, that was actually based on the lack of provenance of the digital image, on the seemingly infinite flexibility of the vector within daily life. The social networking site like Facebook is a sort of platform for extracting a rent from what is used to be called blogging. The rent takes two forms. First, there's the advertising revenue. But second, there's a kind of information rent. Users pay with their information, and that information fuels the development of the business. As of 2011, Facebook was the dominant social networking platform in the United States, with a notional value of billions. By the time you read this, who knows? Part of its success was due to the American college culture nature of its governing metaphor, the Facebook. Its proprietors did not too strongly insist that its users be in some sense true to themselves, but certain common practices of self-presentation took hold. Its proprietors did not too strongly insist that its users be in some sense true to themselves, but certain common practices of self-presentation took hold. Every page looks more or less the same, and most people present themselves as some version of themselves. Facebook eclipsed MySpace, at least among users who were or aspired to be presentably middle class. MySpace had a lingering popularity among military service personnel, and among gay and lesbian youth, and young people of color. This is of course just in the United States. Everywhere in the world, other social networking platforms occupied the dominant supplemental positions. Quite particular niche was occupied, at least in the United States, by another site, Tumblr. Started in 2007, its interface works nicely with short posts that are heavy on pictures. It's easy to repost pictures from one person's Tumblr to another. Its New York-based proprietors seem not to care about the authenticity of the identities its users create, nor are they so bothered by material that the Facebook would find obscene. People use Tumblr for all sorts of things. One thing its qualities as a vector lend itself to is the construction of anonymous or pseudonymous. Why does that word bother me so much? Anonymous or pseudonymous identities who share and comment on images of their desires. Needless to say, there's a furious trading in images of the girl, a cutting and pasting of every possible permutation of her and what is proximate to her. The girl finds herself juxtaposed to fashion naturally, but also to porn, to confessional, to everyday life. Sometimes she remains attached to the commodities over which she presides, but sometimes she gets a divorce from them. Here the whole other economy of thefts and gifts in which the girl participates. It will never make her go away, but perhaps at least in its small nudge toward making her join the living dead, or that phantasmagoria that stalks the everyday without commanding it. In the great materialist poets, from Lucretius to Leopoldi to Marx, the gods are still present, but they just look on. It is they who are caught in the spectacle of us, not who are caught in the spectacle of them. At the end of today's readings, I hope at some point you felt the slight twinge, possibly just above your fifth rib, midway between the front of your torso and the back, of that growing shame that should be developing, possibly an inch above your diaphragm. If it hasn't yet, It will. It will. I'm good at what I do. So, I don't have any notes as to how to wrap up the class. But as you can tell from the maybe you can't tell. Recap all the readings. I read an essay. By Gabriel Popsky from his book Bordering and Ordering in the 21st Century that discusses what borders are from a theoretical perspective. I subsequently read an essay, portions of an essay by Jane Torpy from the book she edited called Documenting Individual Identity. The essay is called Protocols of Identity. Then I read 2 essays by Dr. Mackenzie Wark. These are all doctors, by the way. They're not just random people. By Dr. Mackenzie Wark. One entitled Games... What is it called? Play and such. Called Games and Play in Everyday Life. And then The Little Sisters Are Watching You. For those who are interested in this last book, the essay following The Little Sisters Are Watching You is an essay called Shit is Fucked Up and Bullshit. I'm not going to read that essay to you at this point. I may never read that essay to you as an audience, but I highly encourage you to pick up all these books and read through them. One, to try to get an idea of sort of that trajectory of essays and where things are going for this specific class, which is not a real class. It's really just a way for me to cultivate an internalization of your own personal shaming. And 2, because they're immediately useful to you should you happen to be a student of any of these fields. I don't have any plans for within game. Don't forget, there's a game to make any carrier jumps at the time being. I'm currently docked in Futhark. Apologies to Lady Rupee Bear of the Prismatic Imperium, who I informed I would be going over to Kaspatsuria with the rest of the Imperial School Board. Or rather, with the Imperial School Board. I will not be doing that. I'm going to stick around at Futhark. But I will make my way into Kaspatsuria here and there as I do random mission grinding. I think I'm just going to spend a little bit of time building up my combat chops again. I may find myself in the company of the griefers and gankers again in order to simply up my skill level again after months of trading and trying to save up for the fleet carrier. In the event that I do another fleet carrier tour, it will likely be an engineer's tour. So I may make the trip out to Colonia to get the Colonia engineers. I will give that information to you as it comes. I may also just do one that's in the bubble, just for the sake of doing one that's in the bubble before making my way out to Colonia again. Now, I've yet to have been out to Colonia in my PlayStation account yet. For those of you who were paying attention and doing the reading, I made my way out to Loss on my PC account for a story opportunity, or rather for a part of the narrative that I'm writing, which you can read in that name 3307. I've also begun with the logs for name 3308. So you can log on, I think The Discord has the links to the main logs page for the squadron. I believe my Twitch page has that as well. You can log on there and check them out. Again, you have to read them in reverse order rather than top to bottom because they're posted in reverse order. Beyond that, I don't have any other things to discuss. I don't know if anybody that I care about is currently streaming, so I may or may not raid with my 0 viewers. Let's see who's in here. I learned how to raid like 4 days ago, so apparently people do that. There's a person here who I don't know. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to raid people. Anyway, I will see you next Tuesday.
Super strengths retracted. Access corridor is clear. From the dawn of humankind, we've looked to the stars for meaning. Amidst the trivialities of existence, they have watched over us and forgiven us our awe and wonder. The briefest respite between our labors and strife. In our arrogance, we surrendered to our own conceit. Our search became our right, and for millennia we spread our message of our rightful place amongst the stars with one another. The stars aligned, we proclaimed, to provide us with the guidance we required. Our labors became our destiny, our wars our triumph. We assumed our place amongst the stars, and the stars watched over us, shivering in approval. In time we forgot. We grew indifferent to our watchful stewards, and turned our attention away from them. We turned to one another. We saw one another, and we took the guidance given us by the stars to show one another the error of one another's ways. The stars have shown us, we proclaimed. The labors we have undertaken and the wars we have fought sanctioned by stars and just by their guidance. And others proclaim the stars' condemnation. It is our labors and wars sanctioned. The stars have shown us, the others proclaimed. In our arrogance, we tore the stars from one another. No longer joined as our watchful stewards, the stars became ours, and our rightful place amongst the stars was true to the stars' rightful place amongst us. And in our rightful place we labored, and we made war with one another. And the wars we made with one another drove us further and further amongst the stars, amongst ourselves. And amongst ourselves we looked for meaning. How long is this? I seriously think I'm gonna read all this, do you, Dad? Yeah, this is like 5 pages of garbage. Garbage, Dad!
Miles, can you just...
What? It just goes on and on. No one cares about this kind of stuff, Dad.
You just...
Fine. Gosh. I'm picking up here. In 2979, a consortium of scholars, pilots, and private interests came together to discuss our future. Amidst the wars between the Federation, the Empire, and the Alliance, the intrigue, the subterfuge, and the myriad labors of all powers, we were being reminded of our place amongst the stars. And the stars have begun to remind us of their place amongst us. We were not their equals. The stars, this consortium reminded us, had given us meaning and we had squandered its resolve. The stars, this consortium reminded us, had many others over whom they'd watched. And we came to know some of those others over whom the stars watched. The Guardians had taken their place amongst the stars long before us. The Fargoods had taken their place as well. And they too, the stars, reminded of their place. The stars watched over us all, and we had all grown arrogant in our assumption of our place amongst them. In our arrogance, we had turned to one another. We had once come to know our place amongst the stars was our own, this consortium reminded us. And this consortium reminded us that the stars had watched us come to know these things. The stars have begun again to provide us with meaning this consortium now wants us to know. And this consortium is resolved to remind us of this meaning. For this meaning is given us by the stars. This meaning is given us all, and this resolve the purpose of our labors, our strife. This consortium, we are now reminded, has resolved to remind us all the meaning given us by the stars to all, be us of the Empire, the Federation, the Alliance, or any others. In 3307, the labors and the strife of this consortium, undertaken to remind us all of the meaning being given us by the stars, were given a name. My name is Cadence, and I'm a pilot. My name is Coral. That's it? What? You're just gonna say your name and that's it? You're not gonna say anything about yourself? What, I need to label myself? None of us are super insecure like you, Cadence. What? I'm not insecure, you don't talk to me like that.
Girls,
Bitch.
for fuck's sake, can you just stick to the script, please?
We're pilots. Speak for yourself. Commanders Half-Lock. We have come to you on behalf of this consortium. We have come to call upon you, as this consortium has charged us, to take your place in the labors and strife this consortium has resolved to undertake, to remind all of the meaning being given us by the stars, to remind all of our place amongst the stars and theirs amongst us. Join us, as this consortium of scholars, pilots, and private interests had joined one another, and had resolved to remind all of the meaning being given us by the stars. We already incorporated. Dad, do we really have to use these voice changers?
Girls.
Yeah, it's, we just sound like
Girls.
a couple of guys.
We've assigned a landing pad for you. Be careful.
Ship restraints retracted. Access corridor is clear.
From the dawn of humankind, we have looked to the stars for meaning. Amidst the trivialities of existence, they have watched over us and forgiven us our awe and wonder. The briefest respite between our labors and strife. In our arrogance, we surrendered to our own conceit. Our search became our right, and for millennia we spread our message of our rightful place amongst the stars with one another. The stars aligned, we proclaimed, to provide us with the guidance we required. Our labors became our destiny, our wars our triumph. We assumed our place amongst the stars, and the stars watched over us, shimmering in approval. In time we forgot. We grew indifferent to our watchful stewards and turned our attention away from them. We turned to one another. We saw one another, and we took the guidance given us by the stars to show one another the error of one another's ways. The stars have shown us, we proclaimed. The labors we have undertaken and the wars we have fought sanctioned by the stars and just by their guidance. And others proclaim the stars' condemnation. It is our labors and wars sanctioned. The stars have shown us, the others proclaimed. In our arrogance, we tore the stars from one another. no longer joined as our watchful stewards. The stars became ours, and our rightful place amongst the stars was true to the stars' rightful place amongst us. And in our rightful place we labored, and we made war with one another. And the wars we made with one another drove us further and further amongst the stars, amongst ourselves. And amongst ourselves we looked for meaning. How long is this? I seriously think I'm gonna read all this to you, Dad? Yeah, this is like 5 pages of garbage. Garbage, Dad!
Girls, can you just...
What? It just goes on and on. No one cares about this kind of stuff, Dad.
Just...
Fine. Gosh. I'm picking up here. In 2979, a consortium of scholars, pilots, and private interests came together to discuss our future. Amidst the wars between the Federation, the Empire, and the Alliance, the intrigue, the subterfuge, and the myriad labors of all powers, we were being reminded of our place amongst the stars. And the stars have begun to remind us of their place amongst us. We were not their equals. The stars, this consortium reminded us, had given us meaning and we had squandered its resolve. The stars, this consortium reminded us, had many others over whom they'd watched. And we came to know some of those others over whom the stars watched. The Guardians had taken their place amongst the stars long before us. The Fargoods had taken their place as well. And they too, the stars, reminded of their place. The stars watched over us all, and we had all grown arrogant in our assumption of our place amongst them. In our arrogance, we had turned to one another. We had once come to know our place amongst the stars was our own, this consortium reminded us. And this consortium reminded us that the stars had watched us come to know these things. The stars have begun again to provide us with meaning this consortium now wants us to know. And this consortium is resolved to remind us of this meaning. For this meaning is given us by the stars. This meaning is given us all, and this resolve the purpose of our labors, our strife. This consortium, we are now reminded, has resolved to remind us all the meaning given us by the stars to all, be us of the Empire, the Federation, the Alliance, or any others. In 3307, the labors and the strife of this consortium, undertaken to remind us all of the meaning being given us by the stars, were given a name. My name is Cadence, and I'm a pilot. My name is Coral. That's it? What? You're just gonna say your name and that's it? You're not gonna say anything about yourself? What, I need to label myself? None of us are super insecure like you, Cadence. What? I'm not insecure, you cunt. Don't talk to me like that.
Girls,
Bitch.
for fuck's sake, can you just stick to the script, please?
Anyway, we're pilots. Speak for yourself. Commanders Half-Lock. We have come to you on behalf of this consortium. We have come to call upon you, as this consortium has charged us, to take your place in the labors and strife this consortium has resolved to undertake, to remind all of the meaning being given us by the stars, to remind all of our place amongst the stars and theirs amongst us. Join us, as this consortium of scholars, pilots, and private interests had joined one another, and had resolved to remind all of the meaning being given us by the stars. We already incorporated. Dad, do we really have to use these voice changers?
Girls.
Yeah,
Hold
it's,
on.
we just sound
Girls.
like a couple of guys.